Chapter 1: A Spreading Stain. The air in the root cellar hung thick, a damp chill that clung to Myra Clay's rough-spun tunic. It was a familiar cold, one she had worked alongside for 7 seasons in Haven, their secluded sanctuary against a world they believed was tearing itself apart. Usually the scent here was earthy, a comforting mix of soil, potatoes, and the faint sweetness of stored apples. Today, something else pricked her nostrils. A faint, acrid undertone, sharp and unsettling. Myra held her flickering tallow lamp higher. Its meager light cast long, dancing shadows from the neatly stacked crates and burlap sacks. Haven's survival depended on these stores, on the meticulous planning and backbreaking labor that filled this underground space. Jedediah Stern, their founder and elder, often proclaimed, "The earth provides for the faithful, but she demands diligence." Diligence they had given. Her gaze settled on a crate of winter squash, harvested only a month prior, firm and heavy then. Now a dark, slimy patch oozed from the side of one, spreading like a grotesque bruise. She prodded it with a hesitant finger. The flesh, usually resilient, gave way with a squelch, releasing a more potent wave of the foul odor. Her stomach tightened. This was not normal rot. Normal rot was slow, predictable. This was aggressive. "Something wrong, Myra?" She started, turning to see Caleb Vetch standing in the doorway, his tall frame nearly filling the low archway. His hand rested on the wooden truncheon at his belt, a habit he'd developed since Jedediah appointed him head of compound security. His eyes, pale and intense, scanned the cellar. "Caleb," Myra acknowledged, straightening. "I was checking the squash. This one," she gestured, "it's turned." Caleb stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the earthen floor. He peered at the offending vegetable, his brow furrowed. "One bad squash. Happens. Toss it out. Further from the others." "It's not just one," Myra said, her voice quiet but firm. She moved the lamp along the row. Another crate further down showed a similar dark stain seeping through the slats, and another. And it's the speed of it. These were sound when we stored them. I checked them myself. Caleb's frown deepened. He was a man of simple convictions. The world outside Haven was damned, their community was righteous, and Elder Jedediah's pronouncements were immutable truths. Complex problems, especially ones that cast doubt on Haven's blessed state, made him uneasy. Pests, perhaps, or damp got in more than usual. "The seals on the cellar door are good. We checked them before the first frost," Myra countered, running a hand along a support beam. The wood felt dry. "No sign of rats, and this isn't a pest mark I recognize." She had grown up learning herbs and husbandry from her grandmother, a woman who knew the land's secrets and its sicknesses. This felt alien. "Jedediah won't like to hear this," Caleb stated, his gaze fixed on the spoiled produce. "The harvest blessing was strong this year. He said the yields would sustain us through any trial." Myra bit her lip. Questioning Jedediah's pronouncements, even implicitly, was frowned upon. But facts were facts, and the stench of decay was undeniable. "Be that as it may, Caleb, something is spoiling our food, and quickly. We need to sort through everything. Now." He grunted, a sound of reluctant agreement. "I'll get a couple of the younger lads. We'll haul out anything that looks suspect, but you speak to Jedediah. He listens to you more than most." Myra nodded. Jedediah did have a measure of respect for her skills as a healer and her practical knowledge. Whether that respect would extend to news that contradicted his optimism remained to be seen. Later, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks that ringed their valley, casting long purple shadows across the compound, Myra approached Jedediah's small, meticulously kept cabin. He sat on his porch, a thick, leather-bound book open on his lap, though his eyes were on the darkening sky. His white beard flowed over his chest, making him look like a prophet. Elder, Myra began, her hands clasped before her. Jedediah turned his head, his eyes, though aged, still sharp. Myra, come, sit. The evening air is crisp, clears the mind. She remained standing. Elder, I have some concerns about the root cellar. She explained what she and Caleb had found, choosing her words carefully, avoiding alarmist tones. She described the unusual nature of the spoilage, the speed, the strange odor. Jedediah listened, his expression unchanging. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. Finally, he said, "The adversary works in many ways, Myra. He seeks to sow doubt, to weaken our faith. A trial, perhaps, a test of our resolve." "With respect, Elder," Myra pressed gently, "this feels like more than a spiritual trial. This is a physical problem if it spreads." "Faith, Myra," Jedediah interrupted, his voice gaining a sterner edge. "Faith is our shield. We will pray. We will redouble our vigilance against sin and doubt within the community, and you will continue your good work. Perhaps a poultice, some herbs you know, can slow this blemish." He waved a dismissive hand. "Do not let fear take root." Myra felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. A poultice for a rot that ate squash from the inside out. He wasn't truly listening, or he was choosing not to. "Yes, Elder," she said, her voice flat. There was no arguing further. As she walked away, the scent of wood smoke from the communal kitchen chimney mingled with a phantom whiff of that acrid smell from the cellar. She passed Tabitha Rowe, who was hurrying towards her own small dwelling, her infant son, Samuel, bundled tightly against her chest. Tabitha's face was etched with worry, a common expression for the young mother these days. "Myra," Tabitha whispered, her eyes wide, "is it true about the food?" News, it seemed, spread faster than any spoilage in Haven. "We're looking into it, Tabitha," Myra tried to reassure her, though her own confidence was thin. "We're taking precautions." Tabitha clutched Samuel tighter. "He needs to eat, he's so small." Her voice was tight with a fear Myra understood all too well. Every parent in Haven felt it, a constant, low hum beneath the surface of their daily lives, the fear of not enough. That night Myra lay on her simple cot, the sounds of Haven settling around her, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft murmur of voices from a nearby cabin, the rustle of wind in the pines. But overlaying it all was the memory of that dark, spreading stain and Jedediah's unwavering, unseeing faith. A new, deeper fear began to coalesce within her. It wasn't just the food they had to worry about. It was the hunger of denial, a blindness that could consume them all long before starvation did. The first tendrils of a truly chilling thought wrapped around her heart. What if the greatest threat to Haven wasn't the spoiling food, but their own inability to face the truth of it? The silence of her small cabin felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken dread. The problem was here, inside their walls, and it was growing. Chapter 2: Whispers in the Ranks. The following days in Haven acquired a strained quality. On the surface, routines continued. Morning prayers were offered with fervent voices. Work details were assigned and carried out. Children's laughter, though perhaps a little more subdued, still echoed in the crisp autumn air. But beneath this veneer, an undercurrent of unease flowed, palpable as the chill that now seemed to permanently reside in the lower sections of the compound, near the troubled root cellar. Caleb Vetch, with a grin set to his jaw, oversaw the sorting of the stores. He'd roped in young men like Silas Croft and Ben Southers, their faces grim as they hauled out crate after crate. The pile of spoiled vegetables and fruits grew at an alarming rate. Potatoes, which should have lasted months, were found with soft, weeping lesions. Apples, meticulously wrapped and stored, were dissolving into mush. Even some of the hardier root vegetables, carrots, parsnips, showed signs of an unnatural, rapid decay. Each rotten piece was thrown onto a pyre at the edge of the compound, the smoke a constant, acrid reminder of their dwindling sustenance. "It's like a curse," Silas muttered one afternoon, wiping sweat and grime from his brow as he tossed a liquefying pumpkin onto the fire. The flames leaped, consuming it with a wet hiss. Caleb, standing nearby, his arms crossed, shot him a sharp glance. "Watch your tongue, Croft. There are no curses in Haven, only tests of faith. Elder Jedediah is clear on that." Silas visibly flinched. "Yes, Caleb, of course." He didn't meet Caleb's eye, turning back to his work with renewed, if sullen, vigor. But the sentiment, unspoken by many, festered. Myra heard the whispers. In the communal dining hall, where portions were becoming noticeably smaller, conversations would hush when she approached. She saw the worried glances exchanged between mothers, the way children looked longingly at the emptying serving platters. Myra herself spent hours in the root cellar, not just identifying spoiled goods, but trying to understand the phenomenon. She brought her satchel of herbs and tinctures, experimenting with various drying agents, antifungal powders, and preservative smokes she'd learned from her grandmother's old books. Nothing seemed to slow the aggressive rot. It defied all known patterns of decay. It was as if some invisible blight had seeped into the very soil of their valley, tainting everything it touched. One evening she was examining a sack of onions. They looked fine from the outside, their papery skins intact. But when she sliced one open, the inner layers were a translucent, gelatinous gray. A faint, almost sweet but deeply unpleasant odor emanated from it. She recoiled. "This makes no sense," she murmured to herself, her breath fogging in the cellar's cold. She had meticulously documented everything: temperature fluctuations minimal, humidity levels stable, signs of vermin none. The spoilage seemed to originate from within the produce itself, a corruption blooming unseen until it was too late. Tabitha Rose sought her out more frequently. Her baby, Samuel, was fussier than usual, his small cries thin and reedy. "He's not getting enough, Myra," Tabitha said, her voice ragged with exhaustion and fear. Her eyes were shadowed, her cheekbones more prominent than Myra remembered. "My milk, it's less. And what little solid food I try to give him from my own share, he barely touches." Myra examined Samuel. He was indeed underweight, his skin loose. She offered Tabitha what comfort she could, herbal teas to promote lactation, advice on mashing the least affected vegetables into a pulp for the baby. But her own heart ached with a sense of helplessness. What good were herbs against a creeping starvation? Jedediah says we must fast and pray, Tabitha continued, almost to herself. He says it will purify us, make us worthy of deliverance. Myra thought of the growing pyre of rotting food. Fasting is one thing when there is a choice, Tabitha. This is being forced upon us. Tabitha looked at her, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, fear, or perhaps a desperate, dawning anger. What if there isn't enough for the winter? What will we do? Myra had no answer. The community had always prided itself on its self-sufficiency. They had weathered lean times before, but always with the knowledge that their stores, carefully managed, would see them through. This was different. This felt like an insidious siege. Caleb Vetch, meanwhile, found his own ways to cope with the mounting pressure. His patrols became more frequent, his scrutiny of the community members more intense. He started instituting new rules. No unauthorized entry to the food stores, he declared at one evening gathering, his voice ringing with authority. All rationing will be handled directly by myself or those I appoint. Waste will not be tolerated. Hoarding will be punished. His gaze swept across the assembled faces, lingering on those he deemed less devout, or those who had dared to voice concerns too openly. A new tension, one of fear not just of hunger but of accusation, began to overlay the existing anxieties. One afternoon, Caleb cornered Barnaby Finch, the community's main hunter, as he returned empty-handed from the forest, his weathered face grim. "Nothing again, Finch." Caleb's tone was sharp. Barnaby sighed, shifting his handmade bow from one shoulder to the other. "The woods are quiet, Caleb, too quiet. Tracks are scarce. Even the squirrels seem to have vanished. It's unnatural." "Unnatural," Caleb scoffed. "Or perhaps your skills are waning, old man, or your faith." Barnaby's eyes narrowed. "I've hunted these woods for haven since the beginning. I know them. Something is wrong out there, same as it's wrong in our cellars." "Excuses," Caleb snapped. "Elder Jedediah says we must rely on what the Lord provides within our haven. Perhaps your focus should be less on wandering the godless woods and more on your duties here. Productive labor." Barnaby stared at Caleb for a long moment, then turned and walked away without another word, his shoulders slumped. The exchange had been witnessed by several others, and the implications were clear. Doubt was weakness, and weakness was a threat. Myra, observing this increasing rigidity, felt a growing sense of alarm. The problem was not just the food, it was how they were reacting to it. Fear was making them turn inward, suspicion replacing trust. Jedediah's calls for faith were becoming a cudgel, and Caleb was its eager wielder. A few days later, a small commotion drew Myra towards the communal kitchen. She found young Pip Sallow, a boy of about 8, sobbing, while his mother, Dinah Creel, stood pale and trembling before Caleb. In Caleb's hand was a half-eaten, slightly bruised apple. "He took it from the discard pile, Myra," Dinah explained, her voice trembling. The ones you said were only slightly damaged, perhaps still edible if cooked quickly. The discard pile is still community property to be distributed fairly. Caleb's voice was hard. This is theft. This is putting oneself before the community. This is the kind of weakness that invites disaster. Pip wailed louder. I was hungry. Myra stepped forward. Caleb, he's just a child. He doesn't understand. He understands hunger, Caleb retorted, his eyes cold. And he needs to understand discipline. Elder Jedediah has warned us about the erosion of our values. He looked from Pip to Dinah. Your son will forego his evening meal ration tonight, and you, Dinah, will take an extra watch duty at the perimeter to reflect on community responsibility. Dinah bowed her head, tears welling in her eyes. Myra wanted to protest, to argue the cruelty of denying a hungry child food, however meager the ration. But the look on Caleb's face, the almost zealous glint in his eyes, stopped her. He was beyond reason on this. He was a man convinced he was fighting a holy war against decay, both physical and moral. As Caleb strode away, Dinah pulled Pip close, murmuring comfort. Myra watched them, a profound sense of dread settling in her stomach. The whispers in Haven were no longer just about spoiled food. They were about fear, about who to trust, and about what desperate acts hunger might drive them to. And some whispers, she was beginning to suspect, were not entirely human. She recalled Pip's earlier claims, dismissed by most, of seeing shadows near the food stores, of hearing things. At the time, she'd thought it a child's overactive imagination. Now she wasn't so sure. The air itself in Haven felt heavy with unvoiced anxieties and something more, something watchful. The hunger was taking root, not just in their bellies, but in their minds. Chapter 3: The First Taste. The scent of the pyre became a permanent fixture in Haven's air, a constant, grim incense. Day by day, the pile of discards grew, and the faces of the community members became more gaunt, their eyes holding a new, hollow look. Jedediah Stern led daily prayers for deliverance, his voice booming across the central clearing, but the words felt increasingly empty to Myra as she watched the last of the autumn abundance turn to slime and ash. Rations were cut again, then again. The communal meals, once a time of fellowship, became tense, silent affairs. People ate slowly, mechanically, their gazes often darting to their neighbors' bowls, a flicker of resentment or calculation in their eyes. Children cried more often from hunger, their small complaints a constant, heartbreaking soundtrack to Haven's decline. Myra continued her desperate, failing battle in the root cellar. She tried sealing individual vegetables in clay, hopping to isolate them from the blight. She experimented with smoking them with different woods, drawing on every piece of lore her grandmother had passed down. Nothing worked. The rot was relentless, insidious. It was as if it possessed a malevolent intelligence, always one step ahead of her efforts. One evening, while sifting through a bin of near-gone carrots, her lamp flickered precariously. As she adjusted the wick, a movement in the deep shadows at the back of the cellar caught her eye. A rustle. She held her breath, lamp held high. Who's there? Silence, then a faint, wet, dragging sound. Her heart hammered. Rats. No, they'd found no sign. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. The lamplight pushed back the darkness, revealing nothing. Just the damp stone walls, the empty crates, but the smell in that corner was different. Thicker, sweeter, with an underlying note of something like damp earth and meat. She shivered, backing away. It was probably just her tired mind playing tricks. The hunger, the stress, it was enough to make anyone see things. Later that week, Orville Prynne, the community's quiet, stooped record keeper, was found dead in his small cabin. Myra was called. Orville lay on his cot, his eyes wide and staring. A thin trickle of dark fluid dried at the corner of his mouth. There were no marks on him. He was elderly, frail. It could have been his heart, stressed by the dwindling food. But as Myra examined him, she noticed something. A small, half-eaten piece of what looked like dried meat lay on the floor beside his cot, almost hidden by a rough blanket. It was dark, almost black, and had a peculiar, fibrous texture. She picked it up carefully. It didn't look like any of the smoked game Barnaby Finch had ever brought in, even in better times. And its smell. It was subtly sweet, with that same strange, earthy undertone she'd caught in the cellar. "What is it?" Caleb asked, his voice gruff. He had followed her into the cabin, his presence looming. "I'm not sure," Myra said slowly, turning the object over in her fingers. "Where would Orville have gotten meat? The stores are bare of it." Caleb shrugged. Perhaps he had a private stash. Some are weaker than others, less willing to share the burden. His eyes scanned the small, tidy cabin as if searching for other signs of hoarding. Myra felt a prickle of unease. Orville had been a meticulous man, devoted to the community. Hoarding seemed out of character. She wrapped the strange morsel in a piece of cloth and put it in her satchel. "I'll examine this further." The death cast another pall over Haven. Jedediah spoke of Orville's passing as a soul called home, freed from earthly trials. But the community saw it as another omen. If even the quiet, devout Orville could succumb, what hope was there for the rest of them? Tabitha Rowe was becoming increasingly frantic. Baby Samuel was now alarmingly thin, his cries weak, his skin pale and clammy. Myra brewed him weak broths from bone scraps and the few edible wild greens she could still find, but it wasn't enough. One afternoon, Myra found Tabitha behind the communal kitchen, her back to the path, hunched over something. Myra approached quietly. Tabitha was scraping at a patch of mossy growth on the shaded side of a discarded wooden barrel. The growth was a strange, pallid color, like bloated fungi, almost luminous in the dim light. Tabitha was carefully collecting small pieces of it into a little clay bowl. "Tabitha," Myra said softly. Tabitha jumped, whirling around, her eyes wide and guilty. She tried to hide the bowl behind her back. "Myra, I was just—" Myra's gaze went to the strange fungus. "What is that, Tabitha?" "I don't know," Tabitha whispered, her voice desperate. "I saw some of the pigs, the ones that are still alive, eating it. They seem eager for it. I thought, maybe Samuel, if it's food for them." Myra's blood ran cold. The few remaining pigs in Haven had become strange, gaunt, yet their eyes held a disturbing, feverish gleam. They ignored their usual slop, rooting aggressively for scraps, for anything. She had seen them near the ever-growing discard pile, eating things that should have repulsed any animal. "Tabitha, no, we don't know what that is. It could be poison." "But he's starving." Tabitha cried, tears streaming down her face. I have to try something, there's nothing else. She held out the bowl. The fungus pieces were moist, almost fleshy. They pulsed with a faint internal light that Myra was sure she was imagining. It doesn't smell bad, almost sweet. Myra took the bowl. The pieces felt oddly warm to the touch. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and for a fleeting second the pale fungus seemed to whisper, to call to a deep, primal hunger within her own belly. She shook her head, pushing the sensation away. This was wrong, terribly wrong. This isn't food, Tabitha, she said, her voice firmer than she felt. We cannot resort to this. There has to be another way. But as she looked into Tabitha's haunted eyes, she saw the abyss of a mother's desperation. What lines wouldn't she cross to save her child? What lines wouldn't any of them cross when the true hunger took hold? Later that night, unable to sleep, Myra took out the piece of dried meat she'd found in Orville's cabin. She examined it again under the light of her lamp. It was definitely not animal flesh she recognized. It was too dense, the fibers too uniform. And that smell, sweet, earthy, almost cloying. She thought of the strange fungus Tabitha had found, of the pig's bizarre behavior. A horrifying thought began to form, a connection she didn't want to make. The aggressive rot in the cellar, the strange fungus appearing in damp, dark places, Orville's death after consuming this unknown substance. Could it be that the spoilage wasn't just decay, but a transformation? Was something growing in their dying food, something new and insidious? And were some, in their desperation, beginning to consume it? The idea was monstrous. She looked at the dark morsel in her hand. Part of her, the pragmatic healer, wanted to analyze it, to understand its properties. Another, deeper part felt a primal revulsion, a screaming urge to cast it into the fire. A scratching sound came from her door, soft, hesitant. Myra froze. Who is it? No answer, just another scratch like fingernails on wood. She rose slowly, her heart pounding, and moved towards the door. Peering through a small crack in the ill-fitting planks, she saw a figure huddled in the darkness. It was Hester Vale, the woman who had lost her family and whose sanity had frayed. Hester was often seen wandering, muttering to herself. But tonight there was something different about her. Her eyes, usually vacant, seemed to gleam in the faint moonlight. She was holding something out, clutched in her dirty hand. A piece of that same pale, fleshy fungus Tabitha had found. Take it, Hester rasped, her voice a dry whisper. It's a gift from the quiet places. It quiets the hunger, makes you strong. Myra stared at the offered fungus. It seemed to pulse faintly in Hester's hand. The sweet, cloying smell reached her even through the door. Hester, what are you talking about? Myra tried to keep her voice steady. The new food, Hester whispered, a strange, beatific smile spreading across her gaunt face. The blessing in the blight. Elder Jedediah talks of tests. This is the answer. The first mother provides. The first mother. Myra had never heard such a term in Haven. Hester's eyes were fixed on her, unblinking, unsettlingly knowing. The woman was clearly unhinged, but there was a terrifying conviction in her voice. Myra slowly shook her head. No, Hester, thank you, but no. Hester's smile faltered, her eyes narrowed. "You will be hungry," she hissed. "You will all be hungry, and then you will understand, then you will taste." With that, Hester Vale turned and melted back into the shadows, leaving Myra trembling by her door. The image of the poolsing Fungus and Hester's ecstatic, mad smile burned into her mind. The first taste, it had already begun. The community wasn't just starving, it was being seduced by a new, horrifying form of sustenance. And Myra feared that the spore servant, the first to truly embrace this blight, was no longer a hypothetical threat. They were already walking among them, perhaps more than one. The hunger was changing them, and the line between survival and monstrosity was becoming terrifyingly thin. The true horror was just beginning to bloom. Chapter 4: The Communion of Shadows. The discovery of Hester Vale's nocturnal offering and her chilling pronouncements about the first mother and the new food settled like a stone in Myra Clay's gut. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a terrifying certainty. Some members of Haven were not just succumbing to hunger, they were actively consuming the unnatural growths, the byproducts of the pervasive blight. And Hester was not alone. Over the next few days, Myra observed with a heightened, fearful acuity. She saw subtle signs, a furtive glance here, a secretive huddle there. She noticed individuals who, despite the dwindling rations, seemed to possess a strange, almost feverish energy. Their skin sometimes had a faint, unhealthy sheen, their eyes a little too bright. They were often seen near the damp, shadowed periphery of the compound, the old wood piles, the crumbling section of the original palisade, the area behind the nearly empty pigsty where Tabitha had found the pallid Fungus. Caleb Vetch, oblivious to this specific, creeping horror, continued his own war against perceived weakness. His patrols were relentless, his pronouncements at evening gatherings increasingly severe. He organized work details to search for any overlooked, hidden caches of food within the cabins, an act that frayed already raw nerves and sowed deeper mistrust. Young Ben Southers, once a cheerful lad, now walked with Caleb, his face a mask of grim determination, his hand often resting on a newly fashioned club. The community was becoming a tinderbox, and Caleb seemed intent on striking sparks. Myra tried to speak to Jedediah Stern again. She found him in his cabin, meticulously cleaning an old oil lamp, his movements precise despite his age. "Elder," she began, her voice low, "I have seen things. Hester Vale, she is not herself. She speaks of a first mother, of a new kind of food found in the rot." Jedediah paused, his gaze lifting to hers. His eyes were cloudy, distant. "Hester has always been fragile. The loss of her family weighed heavily. Her mind wanders." "This is more than wandering, Elder," Myra insisted. "She tried to give me something, a growth. Others, too, I suspect, are consuming these things. Orville Prynne, I believe what I found in his cabin was one of them." Jedediah set the lamp down carefully. "Myra, your diligence is commendable, but you see shadows where there are none. Desperation can make people imagine many things. The only food is that which we have stored, however meager. The only sustenance is faith." "But what if the faith is misplaced?" Myra whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. What if what is happening to our stores isn't a test, but a presence? Something that is actively changing what we have, offering something else in its place. A flicker of something cold passed through Jedediah's eyes. That is dangerous talk, Myra. Talk that borders on blasphemy. The Lord provides. The Lord tests. He does not offer poison in the guise of salvation. He picked up his lamp again, his attention seemingly fixed on a smudge of soot. You are tired. The strain is affecting us all. Focus on your healing, on conventional remedies. Do not chase phantoms. Myra left, her heart heavy with frustration and a growing sense of isolation. Jedediah was a wall, his convictions impenetrable. He would not, or could not, see the abyss opening at their feet. Her attention turned more fully to Tabitha Rowe. The young mother was a ghost of her former self. Samuel was weakening visibly, his cries becoming pitifully faint. Myra shared what little edible herbs and foraged roots she could find, but it was like trying to fill a sieve with water. She often saw Tabitha near the pigsty, her gaze lingering on the patches of pale fungus that seemed to thrive there, spreading with unnatural speed. One afternoon, Myra found Tabitha sitting on the packed earth floor of her small cabin, Samuel lying listless on a thin blanket beside her. Tabitha was staring blankly at the wall. Tabitha, Myra knelt beside her. Tabitha didn't look up. He won't take the broth today, she said, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. He just turns his head away. Myra touched Samuel's forehead. It was cool, too cool. His breathing was shallow. A terrible, cold dread gripped Myra. We need to try something else, Myra said, though she had no idea what. Tabitha slowly turned her head, her eyes meeting Myra. There was a strange emptiness in them, but also a flicker of something else, something Myra couldn't quite name, a desperate resolve, perhaps, or something darker. Yes, Tabitha said, something else. The air in the cabin felt thick, charged. Myra felt a sudden, intense urge to get Tabitha and Samuel out of there, away from the oppressive gloom. But Tabitha's gaze held her, a silent plea mixed with an unnerving stillness. That night the whispers seemed louder, not just the furtive human conversations, but something else. A susurrus on the wind, a faint, collective sigh that seemed to emanate from the damp earth, from the rotting heart of their haven. Myra lay on her cot listening, her senses stretched taut. She thought she heard soft footfalls outside her cabin, too light to be Caleb's patrols. She rose, crept to her window, and peered out. The moon was a sliver, casting weak, deceptive shadows. For a moment she saw nothing. Then a movement near the edge of the central clearing by the path leading towards the old, disused well. Several figures, shrouded in darkness, moving with a strange, gliding stillness. They were heading away from the main cluster of cabins, towards the deeper woods that bordered that side of the compound. She recognized Hester Vale's stooped silhouette, and another, taller figure. Could it be Solomon Birch, the quiet outsider? She couldn't be sure. They disappeared into the trees. A secret gathering, a communion of those who had embraced the new food. Myra's mind raced. She had to know, she had to see. Slipping on her worn boots and pulling her thickest shawl around her, she quietly unlatched her door and stepped out into the cold night. The air was biting, carrying the scent of pine, damp earth, and that faint, sweetish odor that now seemed to permeate everything. Keeping to the shadows, she followed the faint path the figures had taken. It led her away from the familiar sounds of Haven into a silence broken only by the rustle of her own movements and the sigh of the wind in the high branches. The woods here were denser, older. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy. She heard voices ahead, low and rhythmic, a chant. Moving with extreme caution, she pushed aside a curtain of low-hanging pine boughs and peered into a small, hidden clearing. What she saw made her breath catch in her throat. A small fire burned in the center, its flames casting an eerie, flickering light. Around it, perhaps a dozen figures were gathered. Hester Vale was there, her face ecstatic in the firelight. Solomon Birch stood beside her, his usually impassive face strangely animated. And others Myra recognized: Dinah Creel, Pip's mother, her face pale but resolute. Even Lyle Ogden, the pragmatic engineer, his skepticism seemingly abandoned. In the center of their circle, on a flat stone, was a collection of the pale, fleshy fungi, larger and more vibrant than any Myra had seen before. They seemed to glow with a faint, internal luminescence, pulsing gently in time with the group's low chant. "The First Mother provides," Hester intoned, her voice surprisingly strong. "She takes the rot, the decay, the despair, and from it she births new life, new strength." One by one, members of the group stepped forward, took a piece of the fungus, and consumed it with a reverent expression. As they ate, their bodies seemed to subtly change. A tremor would run through them, their eyes would widen, and a look of rapturous understanding would cross their faces. Some swayed, some moaned softly. Myra watched, horrified and transfixed. This was not just people eating strange food out of desperation. This was a ritual, a worship. Then she saw Tabitha Rowe. Tabitha stood slightly apart from the main group, near the edge of the firelight. Samuel was bundled in her arms, motionless. Tabitha's face was a mask of anguish and desperate hope. As Myra watched, Hester Vale approached Tabitha, holding out a small, particularly luminous piece of the fungus. "For the child, sister," Hester said, her voice soft, persuasive. "The mother's gift will make him strong. It will quiet his cries. It will save him." Tabitha hesitated, her gaze fixed on the offered morsel, then on her son's pale face. Myra wanted to scream, to rush forward to stop her, but fear held her rooted to the spot. With a small, choked sob, Tabitha took the fungus. She looked at Samuel, her lips moving in a silent prayer or plea. Then slowly, she brought the fungus towards the baby's mouth. Myra couldn't watch. She squeezed her eyes shut, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. The chanting rose in volume, a strange, ululating sound that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. This was the hunger's echo made manifest, a chorus of delusion and desperation. When she dared to open her eyes again, Tabitha was cradling Samuel, rocking him gently. The baby was still silent. Had he taken it? Myra couldn't tell. Tabitha's face was unreadable in the flickering light. The ritual continued, the consuming, the chanting. Myra felt a wave of nausea. This was beyond anything she could have imagined. The blight in their food stores was not just a physical decay. It was a spiritual one, a parasitic faith taking root in the fertile ground of their despair. The spore servants were no longer just individuals, they were becoming a congregation. She had to get away to warn. Who? Jedediah wouldn't listen. Caleb would likely see this as further proof of spiritual weakness to be stamped out with force, potentially igniting a violent conflict. As she began to back away, a twig snapped under her foot. The chanting stopped. Heads turned, eyes gleaming with an unnatural light fixed on the darkness where she hid. An unbeliever, Hester Vale's voice cut through the silence, sharp as glass. She spies on the mother's grace. Solomon Birch stepped forward, his face no longer impassive but hardened, predatory. She should be invited to share, to understand. Myra didn't wait. She turned and fled, crashing through the undergrowth, the sounds of pursuit erupting behind her, shuffling feet, guttural calls. She ran blindly, terror lending speed to her limbs, the horrifying images of the ritual burning in her mind. The communion of shadows was real, and she had just stumbled into its heart. Haven was no longer just starving. It was being consumed from within by a hunger far more terrifying than mere emptiness. Chapter 5. The Reddening Snow. Myra burst from the woods, her lungs aching, her shawl snagged and torn. She didn't stop running until she reached the relative safety of the main compound, her heart hammering against her ribs like a wild drum. The sounds of pursuit had faded behind her, but the chilling images of the nocturnal ritual, the glowing fungus, Tabitha's desperate act, and the predatory gleam in the eyes of her fellow community members remained seared into her consciousness. She leaned against the cold, rough-hewn wall of the communal kitchen, gasping for breath. The pre-dawn air was frigid, and a few hesitant snowflakes had begun to drift down from the leaden sky, the first of the true winter. They landed on her heated skin, melting instantly. She had to tell someone, but who? Jedediah was a lost cause, his mind sealed by dogma. Caleb. Caleb would react with violence, and Myra feared that violence would only escalate the situation, driving the believers further underground, making them more dangerous. But doing nothing was unthinkable. As gray light began to seep into the sky, she saw Caleb Vetch emerge from his cabin, his breath plumbing in the cold. He was already alert, his gaze sweeping the compound. He spotted her immediately. "Myra, what are you doing out at this hour? You look like you've seen a spirit." His eyes narrowed with suspicion. Myra hesitated, the words caught in her throat. How could she explain what she'd seen without sounding mad herself? "Caleb," she began, her voice hoarse. "There was a gathering in the woods last night." Caleb's posture stiffened. A gathering? Who? What were they doing? She described it as best she could, the fire, the chanting, the strange fungus, Hester Vale leading them. She mentioned Solomon Birch, Dinah Creel, even Lyle Ogden. She deliberately omitted Tabitha and Samuel, a knot of pity and fear tightening within her. If Tabitha had indeed given the fungus to her child, Myra couldn't bear to think of the consequences, or of Caleb's wrath descending upon the desperate mother. Caleb listened, his expression growing darker with each word. When she finished, he was silent for a moment, his jaw clenched. "Fungus," he spat, "worshipping rot. This is what the weakness Jedediah warned of has bred, heresy, abomination." They believe it's a gift, Myra said, trying to make him understand the delusion. They call it the first mother's blessing. There is only one God, and he does not offer blessings in the form of decay. Caleb's voice was like cracking ice. This ends now. I'll rouse the guard. We'll root them out. Caleb, wait, Myra pleaded. Violence will only make it worse. They are desperate, deluded. They need help, not punishment. They need to be reminded of Haven's laws, Caleb said, his eyes hard, and the price of breaking them. He turned and strode towards the small barracks where his handful of young, zealous guards slept. Myra watched him go, a sense of impending doom washing over her. This was going to be a disaster. The snow began to fall more heavily, fat, wet flakes that quickly started to coat the ground in a thin white layer. The compound slowly came to life, figures emerging from cabins, their faces grim in the morning chill. The news of Caleb's intentions spread like wildfire. Fear and anticipation hung heavy in the air. Caleb, flanked by Ben Southers and two other young men armed with clubs, marched towards Hester Vale's dilapidated cabin at the edge of the compound. A small crowd gathered at a distance, watching, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. Hester Vale, Caleb's voice boomed. Come out. By order of Elder Jedediah and the Haven Council, you are summoned to answer for your transgressions. There was no response from within the cabin. The only sound was the soft hiss of the falling snow. Caleb gestured to Ben. Open it. Ben Southers, his young face set in a determined frown, kicked at the flimsy door. It splintered and creaked open. Caleb pushed past him and entered, the others following. Myra held her breath. She could hear muffled shouts from inside, then a scuffling sound. After a moment, Caleb emerged, dragging a struggling Hester Vale. Her hair was wild, her eyes blazing with a fanatic light. Unhand me, blasphemer, Hester shrieked, her voice cracking. The mother will protect her own. There is no mother here but the earth that will cover your sins, Caleb retorted, shoving her towards the center of the clearing. Solomon Birch was brought out next, struggling silently but fiercely. Then Dinah Creel, weeping, trying to shield her face. Lyle Ogden looked pale and terrified, offering no resistance. Jedediah Stern appeared, walking slowly from his cabin, his face grave. He surveyed the scene, the falling snow dusting his white beard. Caleb, Jedediah said, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. What is the meaning of this? Elder, Caleb announced, his voice ringing with self-righteousness. These individuals were found engaging in profane rituals, consuming substances anathema to our laws and our faith. Myra Clay witnessed it herself. All eyes turned to Myra. She felt a flush of heat despite the cold. She hadn't intended for it to come to this, a public shamming, a witch hunt. Jedediah looked at the accused, his expression unreadable. Is this true? Have you forsaken the path of righteousness for what? Hester spat on the snowy ground. We have embraced the truth, old man, the truth you are too blind to see. The first mother offers sustenance when your God offers only starvation. A gasp went through the crowd. Such open defiance of Jedediah was unheard of. This mother, Jedediah said, his voice trembling slightly. "What is this blasphemy you speak of?" "She is the life in decay," Solomon Birch spoke, his voice surprisingly strong. "She is the cycle. We honor her by partaking of her gifts." He held up his hands, which were stained with a faint, earthy brown. "We are becoming one with her." Myra noticed that the skin on Solomon's hands looked wrong, slightly puffy, with a network of fine, dark veins just beneath the surface, like the mycelial threads of a fungus. A chill snaked down her spine. The spore servants were not just consuming, they were being consumed, changed from within. Caleb stepped forward. "They are corrupted, elder, tainted. They must be cleansed." His hand rested on his truncheon. "Cleansed?" Dinah Creel sobbed. "What do you mean, cleansed?" Suddenly, a commotion at the edge of the crowd. Tabitha Rowe pushed her way through, her face wild, her eyes blazing. Samuel was clutched tightly in her arms, still wrapped in his blanket. "Leave them alone," Tabitha screamed, her voice raw. "You don't understand. You don't know what it's like to watch your child starve." Caleb turned towards her, his expression hardening. "Tabitha Rowe, were you among them last night?" Tabitha hesitated, her gaze darting from Caleb to the accused, then to Myra. Myra gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "No," Tabitha said, her voice trembling. "No, I was, but they are not evil. They are just hungry. We are all hungry." As she spoke, the blanket around Samuel slipped slightly. Myra caught a glimpse of the baby's face. It was unnaturally pale, his skin almost translucent, and his eyes were open, fixed, and seemed to possess a faint, milky luminescence. Myra felt her stomach lurch. No one else seemed to notice in the tense standoff. Caleb was focused on Tabitha, his suspicion palpable. "Hunger does not excuse heresy, Tabitha." At that moment, Hester Vale let out a guttural cry and lunged, not at Caleb, but towards the small pile of confiscated fungus that one of Caleb's guards had placed on the ground. She scrabbled for it, stuffing a piece into her mouth. "No," Caleb roared, swinging his truncheon. The club connected with Hester's side with a sickening thud. She crumpled to the snowy ground, a gasp escaping her lips, but her eyes, as she looked up, were filled with triumph. She chewed and swallowed. "The mother strengthens," she wheezed. Then something horrifying happened. The flesh around the wound where the truncheon had struck seemed to ripple. The skin split, not with blood but with a pale, fibrous growth that pushed outwards, like a rapidly blooming mushroom. Within seconds, a grotesque fungal mass erupted from Hester's side, pulsing gently. Screams erupted from the crowd. People stumbled back, their faces contorted in terror and disbelief. Caleb stared, his truncheon falling from his nerveless fingers. Even Jedediah took a faltering step backward, his face ashen. Hester Vale began to laugh, a wet, gurgling sound. The fungal growth on her side seemed to expand, to reach. Her eyes glowed with that same milky luminescence Myra had seen in baby Samuel. Solomon Birch, seeing his chance, lunged at the nearest guard, his movements unnaturally fast. His hands, now visibly swollen and webbed with dark veins, closed around the guard's throat. The guard choked, his eyes bulging. Chaos erupted. The accused, emboldened by Hester's transformation and Solomon's attack, fought back with a desperate, inhuman strength. The few guards were overwhelmed. The crowd scattered, screaming, trying to flee the sudden, grotesque violence. Myra stood frozen for a second, watching the nightmare unfold. The snow was falling faster now, quickly becoming stained with patches of red where blood met the white ground. The believers, fueled by the strange fungus, fought with a terrifying ferocity, their bodies already showing subtle signs of the blight, skin discolorations, strange swellings, an unnatural resilience to blows that should have felled them. This wasn't cleansing. This was a monstrous birth. The hunger's echo had given way to the hunger's terrible, physical manifestation. Haven was tearing itself apart, and the snow was turning red with the first bloody fruits of its cursed harvest. Chapter 6. The Divided Haven. The eruption of violence in the central clearing shattered Haven's fragile facade of unity. What had been a community bound by shared belief and a common goal of survival was now a battlefield, its inhabitants divided by fear, fanaticism, and the horrifying physical transformations brought about by the new food. Hester Vale, the fungal mass on her side pulsing rhythmically, was a terrifying figure. She moved with an unnatural agility, her touch seeming to spread a rapid, localized version of the blight on those she managed to grab. Solomon Birch, his strength enhanced, fought with silent, brutal efficiency, his eyes glowing with an eerie white light. Dinah Creel, surprisingly, was a whirlwind of desperate fury, protecting the other believers and lashing out at anyone who came near. Lyle Ogden, the engineer, had seemingly succumbed entirely, his movements jerky and puppet-like, a strange clicking sound emanating from his throat. Caleb Vetch, recovering from his initial shock, roared and rallied his remaining loyalists. He grabbed a discarded wood axe and waded into the fray, his face a mask of fury and grim determination. Abominations, you will not defile this haven. Jedediah Stern, his face a deathly pallor, had retreated to the steps of the small meeting hall, watching the carnage with wide, uncomprehending eyes. His pronouncements of faith and divine tests seemed utterly meaningless in the face of this grotesque reality. Myra Clay found herself caught in the maelstrom. Her first instinct was to help the injured, but the nature of the conflict made that nearly impossible. The believers, or blighted, as some were now screaming, seemed resistant to normal injury, their wounds often sprouting the same pale, fibrous growths instead of bleeding freely. Those they injured, if the contact was prolonged or their skin broken by a blighted touch, sometimes showed rapid signs of something. A spreading discoloration, a tremor, a vacant look in their eyes. She saw Ben Suthers go down, a cry cut short as Solomon Birch's strangely altered hands closed over his face. When Solomon moved on, Ben lay still for a moment, then his limbs began to twitch, his head lolling at an unnatural angle. "Ben!" Myra cried, starting towards him. "Stay back, Myra," a voice yelled. It was Barnaby Finch, the old hunter. He appeared at her side, his bow drawn, an arrow nocked. They're not themselves anymore." His face was grim, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene. The initial, furious clash lasted perhaps 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. When a semblance of a lull occurred, the clearing was a horrifying tableau. Several lay dead or dying on both sides. The snow was trampled and stained crimson in a disturbing off-white ichor. The blighted, though fewer in number, had inflicted terrible damage. Hester Vale stood panting, the fungal growth on her side larger now, its tendrils twitching. Solomon Birch surveyed the scene with cold, glowing eyes. Caleb, bleeding from a gash on his arm but still on his feet, roared, "To the main hall! Barricade the doors! We hold there!" The uninfected, those who could still move, stumbled towards the sturdiest building in the compound, dragging their wounded. Myra, her medical bag clutched tight, helped a young woman whose arm had been grazed by Hester's touch. The skin around the wound was already turning a sickly gray. They managed to haul the heavy wooden doors of the meeting hall shut, ramming the thick iron bar into place just as the blighted reached it. Heavy thuds began to echo from the other side, accompanied by guttural cries and Hester's chilling laughter. Inside, the hall was chaos. Wounded lay moaning on the floor. Panicked whispers filled the air. Jedediah Stern sat on the low dais, his head in his hands, rocking slowly. "What have we done?" he murmured. "What has become of us?" Caleb, his chest heaving, leaned against the barred door. "We defend what is ours, elder, what is pure." "Pure," Myra snapped, kneeling beside the young woman with the grayish arm. "Look around you, Caleb. There is nothing pure left in this haven." She tore a strip of cloth for a bandage, her hands trembling. The flesh beneath the cloth felt unnaturally cold. Barnaby Finch was checking the hall's few windows, his expression grim. "They're still out there, circling." Hours passed in a state of siege. The thudding on the doors became sporadic, but the sense of menace from outside was constant. Myra did what she could for the wounded, but her supplies were meager, and some of the injuries were beyond her skill, especially those inflicted by the blighted. The grayish taint seemed to spread slowly, inexorably, in those who had been touched. Tabitha Rowe was among the survivors in the hall, huddled in a corner, clutching Samuel. The baby was unnervingly still and silent. Myra approached her cautiously. "Tabitha," she said softly, "Samuel is he." Tabitha looked up, her eyes wide and vacant. She pulled back the blanket slightly. Samuel's skin was almost luminous in the dim light of the hall. His eyes, open and unblinking, held that same milky, opalescent glow as the blighted. He made no sound, no movement, save for a faint, almost imperceptible twitching of his tiny fingers. "He's quiet now," Tabitha whispered, a strange, distant smile on her lips. "The mother's gift. It worked. He doesn't cry anymore." Myra recoiled, a profound horror washing over her. Samuel was not saved. He was changed, transformed into something else. A silent, infantile spore servant. "Tabitha," Myra said, her voice barely a breath, he is." Tabitha's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion in her eyes. "He's better, isn't he?" The hunger's echo was still strong in Tabitha, twisting her perception. Her maternal love warped into a terrifying acceptance of the monstrous. As dusk began to settle, casting long, gloomy shadows into the besieged hall, a new sound came from outside. Not thudding, but a soft, rhythmic scraping like something being dragged. Then A chorus of low, guttural chanting began, punctuated by Hester Vale's piercing cries. "They're doing something," Barnaby Finch muttered from a window slit. Caleb moved to his side. "What is it?" "They're building something, or bringing something." Myra joined them, peering through a narrow gap in the wooden shutters. In the dying light, she could see the blighted moving around the pyre where they had once burned the spoiled food. But the pyre was no longer just for burning. They were adding to it branches, pieces of broken furniture from the ransacked cabins, and Myra's stomach churned. What looked like the bodies of those who had fallen in the earlier fight, both blighted and uninfected. Hester Vale stood before the growing mound, her arms raised, chanting in a language Myra didn't recognize, yet which resonated with a primal dread. The other blighted echoed her words, their movements jerky, their eyes glowing in the twilight. The pale fungi on their bodies seemed to pulse with a brighter light. "What in God's name are they doing?" Caleb whispered, his bravado momentarily gone. "It's another ritual," Myra said, her voice tight with fear. "They're not just satisfied with consuming the blight. They're worshipping it, feeding it." As if on cue, a section of the pyre seemed to shift, to coalesce. From the heart of the refuse and bodies, something began to rise. It was amorphous at first, a quivering mass of pale, fungal matter, interwoven with dark branches and scraps of cloth. It pulsed with a faint, sickly luminescence, and a low, vibrating hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate deep within the chest. The hum of the first mother. The blighted fell silent, their faces upturned in adoration as the grotesque effigy, or perhaps entity, continued to form, to grow. It was a monument to their dark faith, a living idol born from decay and death. Inside the hall, a collective gasp of horror rippled through the besieged survivors. Jedediah Stern let out a broken sob. "This is not a test," he choked out, his voice hoarse with despair. "This is damnation. We have brought damnation upon ourselves." Myra looked at the terrified faces around her, at the wounded, at Tabitha cradling her silent, glowing child. She looked at Caleb, his face a mixture of rage and dawning terror. Haven was not just divided. It was on the precipice of annihilation, caught between starvation and a monstrous, spreading faith. The choice was no longer about how to survive the hunger, but how to escape the horrifying salvation it had offered. And as the pulsing glow from the monstrous figure outside grew stronger, casting an unholy light through the cracks in their barricades, Myra knew that escape was becoming an increasingly distant hope. The true nature of the hunger was revealing itself, and it was far more sentient and far more malevolent than any of them could have ever imagined. Chapter 7: The Hunger's Call. The sight of the grotesque, pulsing entity forming on the pyre outside the meeting hall plunged the besieged survivors into a new depth of despair. The hum, as Myra silently dubbed it, was a physical pressure, a nauseating vibration that seemed to thrum in their bones and agitate the very air they breathed. It was accompanied by a faint, cloyingly sweet odor, the scent of the new food amplified, now mixed with the charnel stench of the pyre. Inside the hall, the fragile semblance of order collapsed further. Some people wept openly, others prayed with a desperate, frantic fervor that bordered on hysteria. A few simply stared, their faces blank with shock. Jedediah Stern remained on the dais, a broken man, muttering fragments of scripture that offered no comfort against the palpable horror outside. Caleb Vetch, however, seemed to find a new, almost savage resolve in the face of this ultimate abomination. "They will not take this hall," he snarled, hefting the wood axe. "This is our last stand. We fight or we die as ourselves, not as those things." Barnaby Finch, ever the pragmatist, checked his dwindling supply of arrows. "Fighting that thing on the pyre. Caleb, we don't even know what it is." "It's an affront to God," Caleb declared, "and we will strike it down." Myra watched them, her mind racing. Direct confrontation seemed suicidal. The blighted, empowered by their dark communion and the presence of their newly formed idol, were formidable, and the hum itself felt weakening, disorienting. But what was the alternative? Huddle in the hall until they starved, or until the blighted found a way in. The young woman Myra had bandaged, whose arm had been grazed by Hester, let out a low moan. Myra rushed to her side. The grayish tinge on the woman's arm had spread further, and now fine, dark veins like mycelial threads were visible beneath the skin, reaching up towards her shoulder. Her eyes were unfocused, her breathing shallow. "It's cold," the woman whispered, a tremor shaking her body. "And I hear singing so sweet." Myra's blood ran cold. The blight was progressing. The singing, was it the hum or something else? The hunger's echo, perhaps, luring another victim. "Stay with me," Myra urged, though she felt a chilling certainty that the woman was slipping away, not towards death, but towards transformation. Outside, the chanting of the blighted intensified, their voices rising in a cacophony of praise directed at the pulsing entity on the pyre. The hum grew stronger, and with it, a strange, almost imperceptible pull. Myra felt it in her own stomach, a faint, gnawing emptiness, a yearning that was more than just physical hunger. It was a resonance with the entity outside, a call. She saw others reacting to it too. A man near the door, his face gaunt, licked his lips, his eyes fixed on the barricaded entrance with a new, desperate intensity. A child began to whimper, not in fear, but with a sound that was almost longing. "No," Myra whispered, shaking her head, trying to fight off the insidious sensation. "It's a trick, a delusion." But the hunger's call was potent. It bypassed reason, appealing to the most primal instincts, the need to eat, to survive, to belong. It promised satiation, an end to the gnawing emptiness that had plagued them for weeks. Tabitha Rowe, still cradling the eerily silent Samuel, began to hum softly, a discordant melody that seemed to harmonize with the chanting outside. Her eyes, fixed on the door, held a look of rapt attention. "Tabitha," Myra said sharply, grabbing her arm. Tabitha flinched, looking at Myra as if startled from a dream. The vacant look in her eyes cleared slightly. What is it?" "Don't listen to it," Myra urged. "It's not real, it's what corrupted the others." Tabitha looked down at Samuel, whose pale, luminous eyes seemed to be fixed on the door as well. A flicker of doubt, of her old fear, crossed her face. "But Samuel, he's so peaceful now." "He's not peaceful, Tabitha," Myra said, her voice gentle but firm. "He's changed. This isn't the way." The struggle within Tabitha was palpable. The maternal instinct, twisted by desperation and the insidious influence of the blight, warred with the dawning horror of what her child had become, what she herself was on the verge of becoming. Suddenly, a scream from the other side of the hall. The man who had been staring at the door, the one with the desperate look, was now clawing at the barricade, trying to pull the heavy iron bar free. "Let me out," he shrieked, his voice hoarse. "I'm hungry, so hungry they have food the mother calls." Caleb reacted instantly, shoving the man away from the door. "Get a hold of yourself, Thomas. That's not food out there, it's damnation." Thomas scrabbled on the floor, his eyes wild. "But the singing, it promises relief." He began to sob, curling into a ball. The incident sent a fresh wave of panic through the hall. The enemy was not just outside, it was inside them, a latent hunger that could be awakened, a seed of corruption waiting to sprout. Myra realized with dawning horror that the blight wasn't just spread by touch or consumption of the fungus. The hum, the call, it was an infection of the mind, a psychic assault that preyed on their weakened states, their fear, their desperation. The spore servants were not just those who had eaten the fungus. They could potentially be anyone who succumbed to this insidious mental siege. The night wore on, an agonizing crawl of minutes. The hum and the chanting were relentless. Several more survivors began to show signs of succumbing to the call, a distant look in their eyes, a subtle swaying to the rhythm of the chanting, hushed whispers about the sweet singing or the promise of food. Caleb and Barnaby moved among them, trying to keep them focused to break the spell, but it was like fighting shadows. Myra focused on the physically wounded, trying to keep their spirits up, to distract them from the insidious call. But even as she tended to a gash on a young man's leg, she felt the pull herself, a faint, sweet whisper in the back of her mind promising an end to the fear, the cold, the gnawing emptiness. She fought it, clinging to the faces of those she was trying to help, to the memory of what Haven had once been. Towards the deepest hours of the night, when exhaustion was a heavy blanket over everyone, a new sound joined the cacophony from outside. A rhythmic, heavy thudding against the main doors, stronger and more determined than before. "They're trying to break through," Barnaby yelled, peering through a window slit. "They have a ram, a log or something." Caleb, his face grim and streaked with sweat and grime, hefted his axe. "Let them come. We'll give them a welcome they won't forget." He looked around at the remaining able-bodied men, perhaps a dozen of them, their faces pale but resolute. "For Haven, for our souls." The thudding grew louder, the heavy doors groaning under the impacts. Splinters of wood flew inwards. The iron bar holding the doors was visibly bending. Myra knew this was it, the final confrontation. She looked at the terrified faces of the women and children huddled at the back of the hall. She looked at Jedediah, still lost in his despair. She looked at Tabitha, whose humming had become louder, her eyes fixed on the straining doors with an almost eager anticipation. Samuel held before her like an offering. The hunger was calling, and soon its servants would be through the door. The choice was no longer between starvation and a monstrous salvation. The choice, Myra realized with a chilling certainty, was between a quick death fighting or a slow, horrifying transformation into one of the blighted. And as the doors began to splinter and crack, she wasn't sure which was worse. The air thrummed with the hum, and deep within her, the primal, insidious yearning grew stronger, a terrifying echo of the monstrous call from beyond the failing barricade. Chapter 8: The Breach and the Choice. The main doors of the meeting hall shuddered violently with each impact of the makeshift battering ram. Wood splintered, groaned, and cracked, showering the defenders with debris. The iron bar, thick as a man's wrist, was now visibly bowed, shrieking in protest. Outside, the guttural chants of the blighted rose to a fever pitch, a triumphant, hungry chorus accompanying the rhythmic destruction. Caleb Vetch stood at the forefront, axe gripped tightly, his knuckles white. His remaining loyalists fanned out beside him, armed with makeshift weapons, sharpened stakes, heavy tools, a few old, rusty farming implements. Their faces were grim, etched with a mixture of terror and desperate resolve. They were hopelessly outnumbered, outmatched by the unnatural strength and resilience of the blighted, but the instinct to defend, to fight for their lives, burned fiercely. Myra Clay pushed the women, children, and the most severely wounded further towards the back of the hall, near the small, barred windows on the rear wall. If the doors gave way, perhaps some could escape that way, though the drop to the snowy ground outside was significant, and the blighted were surely circling the entire building. It was a slim hope, but it was all she had to offer them. Jedediah Stern finally stirred from his stupor on the dais. He rose slowly, unsteadily, his eyes no longer vacant but filled with a profound, sorrowful clarity. He looked at the splintering doors, at the terrified faces of his flock, at the monstrous glow filtering in from outside. Perhaps this is penance," he murmured, his voice raspy, "for our pride, for believing we could escape the world's sorrows, create a haven by our own hands without true humility." He looked at Caleb. "Son, there may be no victory here, only an end." Caleb didn't look away from the doors. "We make our end mean something, elder." With a deafening crack, one of the heavy wooden doors split from top to bottom. A sliver of the outside world became visible, the swirling snow, the eerie, pulsing light of the fungal entity on the pyre, and the distorted, glowing face of a blighted pressing against the gap. A collective gasp went up from the defenders. "Hold the line," Caleb roared, saliva flying from his lips. The battering ram struck again, and the weakened door burst inwards with a screech of tearing wood and tortured metal. The iron bar snapped, its broken ends flying across the room like shrapnel. The blighted poured in. Hester Vale was at their head, the fungal growth on her side now a grotesque, flowering appendage that seemed to writhe with a life of its own. Her eyes blazed with fanatical light. Solomon Birch, his skin now a mottled patchwork of pale fungus and discolored flesh, moved with a predatory grace, his altered hands already reaching. Behind them pressed a dozen more, their bodies twisted in various stages of transformation, their voices a chorus of hungry moans and ecstatic cries. The clash was immediate, brutal, and desperate. Caleb's axe rose and fell, cleaving into the blighted, but they barely seemed to register the wounds. Pale ichor and fungal matter flew, but they kept coming, driven by the hum and the hunger's call, which now flooded the hall, almost a physical force. Myra watched in horror as Barnaby Finch loosed an arrow at point-blank range into Solomon Birch's chest. The arrow sank deep, yet Solomon merely grunted, snapped the shaft, and continued his advance, a glowing tendril of fungus already beginning to seal the wound. Barnaby, his face a mask of disbelief, fumbled for another arrow but was overwhelmed. The defenders fought with the courage of despair, but it was a losing battle. For every blighted they managed to temporarily disable, two more seemed to push forward. The small confines of the hall became a charnel house, the air thick with the stench of blood, decay, and the sweet, sickly aroma of the blight. Myra saw her chance not for fighting but for something else. While the main battle raged near the broken doorway, she turned her attention to the rear windows. They were high and barred, but the wood of the window frames was old, possibly rotted in places. "Help me," she yelled to a couple of the younger women cowering nearby, their faces pale with terror. "The windows, we have to try." Galvanized by her urgency, they scrambled to her side. Myra used the butt of a heavy candlestick she'd grabbed to hammer at the wooden frame of the nearest window. The wood was soft, punky. It began to splinter. The sounds of the battle were horrific. Screams of pain, guttural roars, the wet thud of blows landing, Hester Vale's insane laughter echoing above it all. Myra didn't dare look. She focused all her energy on the window frame. Suddenly, a figure loomed beside her. Tabitha Rowe. Samuel was still clutched in her arms, his luminous eyes staring blankly. "What are you doing?" Tabitha asked, her voice strangely calm amidst the chaos. "Trying to get out," Myra grunted, striking the frame again. A large piece of wood broke away. "Help me." Tabitha looked at the struggling group, then at the battle raging at the other end of the hall. A flicker of her old self of fear and maternal panic crossed her face. "Out, but the mother, she calls us to join." "That's not the mother, Tabitha," Myra cried, desperation making her voice sharp. "It's a lie. It's death. Look at what it's doing to them." She gestured towards the fight, where one of Caleb's men went down, his body immediately starting to twitch and convulse as fungal tendrils erupted from his wounds. Tabitha stared, her eyes widening. The calm, beatific expression induced by the hunger's echo faltered, replaced by dawning horror. She looked down at Samuel, at his pale, glowing skin, at his unnervingly still form. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh, Samuel, what have I done?" The wood frame finally gave way with a crack. Myra smashed out the remaining glass and began to wrench at the iron bars. They were set deep in the stone, but the mortar around them was old. "The bars," she yelled. "We need leverage." One of the young men who had been fighting near the door, his arm bleeding, saw what she was doing. He disengaged from the fight, grabbed a long, heavy piece of the broken door barricade and rushed over. "Here." Together they jammed the wood behind one of the bars and pulled. The metal groaned. Mortar crumbled. At that moment, a chilling cry cut through the din. Jedediah Stern. He had somehow found an old, rusted sickle and was trying to defend himself against two blighted who had cornered him on the dais. He fought feebly, his age and despair weighing him down. Myra saw Hester Vale turn towards Jedediah, a predatory gleam in her eyes. The fungal appendage on Hester's side lashed out like a grotesque tentacle. No, Myra screamed, but it was too late. The appendage wrapped around Jedediah's leg. He cried out, falling to his knees. The fungal matter began to spread rapidly up his limb, consuming his flesh, transforming it. Myra felt a surge of cold fury. She abandoned the window for a moment, snatched up a heavy wooden stool and charged towards Hester. She brought the stool down with all her might on Hester's head. There was a sickening crunch. Hester stumbled, her eyes losing focus for a second, the appendage retracting slightly from Jedediah. It bought only a moment. Hester snarled, her head lolling at an unnatural angle, and lunged at Myra. Myra dodged, scrambling back towards the window. The bar finally came loose with a screech of tortured metal. One bar down, two more to go. The battle was nearing its end. Most of Caleb's defenders were down, either dead or changing. Caleb himself was still fighting, a bloodied, roaring berserker surrounded by blighted. But he was tiring, his movements becoming slower. Myra, Tabitha's voice sharp with a new desperate clarity. Take him. Myra turned. Tabitha was holding Samuel out to her. The baby's luminous eyes stared unseeingly. What? Myra was stunned. Take him, Tabitha repeated, tears streaming down her face. Get him out of here, maybe. Maybe there's a cure. Maybe if he's away from her. Her voice choked. I can't save him, but maybe you can. I have to help them fight. I have to try to make amends. Before Myra could respond, Tabitha thrust Samuel into her arms. The baby was unnervingly light, his skin cool and clammy, yet a faint warmth pulsed from within him. He smelled faintly of sweet decay. Tabitha then grabbed a fallen piece of sharp metal, her face a mask of tragic resolve. For Haven, she screamed, and charged into the fray, towards the blighted, overwhelming Caleb. Myra stared after her, Samuel clutched to her chest. This was it, the moment of choice. Stay and die or flee with this changed child into an uncertain, hostile wilderness. Another bar came loose from the window. The opening was just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Go, the young man with the bleeding arm urged, pushing one of the terrified women towards the opening. Go now. Myra looked at the desperate, struggling figures, at Caleb making his last stand, at Tabitha fighting with the fury of a redeemed soul. Then she looked down at Samuel, at his pale, glowing face. A tiny, almost invisible tendril of pale fungus was beginning to sprout from the corner of his eye. With a sob, she turned to the window. There was no saving Haven. There was only escape, and the slimmest, most desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, there might be an answer for the child in her arms, an antidote to the hunger's insidious embrace. The choice was made. Survival for now for Samuel, even if it meant carrying a piece of the blight with her. Chapter 9. The Bitter Bloom. Myra squeezed through the narrow opening in the window. Samuel clutched tightly against her chest. The drop to the snow-covered ground was jarring, knocking the breath from her lungs, but she scrambled to her feet, adrenaline coursing through her veins. Behind her, the sounds from the meeting hall were a symphony of horror, the screams, the guttural roars, the wet, teeth-tearing sounds of the final, desperate struggle. She couldn't look back. The young man with the bleeding arm managed to push two more terrified women through the opening before a blighted figure appeared at the window from inside, its glowing eyes fixing on them. The man yelled, "Run!" and heroically tried to block the opening, buying them precious seconds. Myra didn't hesitate. She ran, plunging into the swirling snow, away from the charnel house that Haven had become. The two women followed, stumbling, sobbing. The hum from the monstrous entity on the pyre still pulsed in the air, a malevolent heartbeat, but it seemed to lessen slightly with distance, its insidious call becoming fainter. They skirted the edge of the compound, keeping to the shadows of the few remaining intact cabins, expecting at any moment to be intercepted by more of the blighted. But it seemed most of them were focused on the slaughter in the meeting hall. Or perhaps, Myra thought with a sickening lurch, they were already partaking in a different kind of communion. The snow was falling heavily now, a thick white curtain that mercifully began to obscure the sight of Haven behind them. It also covered their tracks, a small blessing. They reached THE Chinese letter palisade, finding a section where the wood was rotten enough to kick through. Beyond it lay the wilderness, the dark, silent forest that had always ringed their isolated valley. Once they were under the relative cover of the trees, the two women collapsed, gasping for breath, their faces streaked with tears and grime. Myra, though her own legs were trembling, forced herself to keep moving. "We can't stop here," she urged, her voice hoarse. "They might follow. We need to put distance between us." One of the women, whose name Myra thought was Sarah, shook her head, her eyes wide with trauma. "Where can we go? There's nothing out here. We'll freeze. We'll starve." "We'll find somewhere," Myra said, with more conviction than she felt. She looked down at Samuel. His pale, luminous skin seemed to glow faintly even in the dim light filtering through the snow-laden branches. The tiny fungal tendril at the corner of his eye was a fraction larger. He was so light, so cold. A part of her wanted to abandon him, to cast off this tiny vessel of the blight. But Tabitha's desperate plea, her sacrifice, echoed in Myra's mind. And a deeper, more stubborn part of her, the healer, refused to give up on any life, however tainted. They pushed on, deeper into the woods. The snow made progress slow and arduous. Myra had no supplies beyond the small medical satchel she always carried, which contained little of use against the cold or starvation, let alone the blight. The two women had fled with nothing but the clothes on their backs. As night truly fell, they found a shallow overhang of rock that offered minimal shelter from the wind and snow. They huddled together for warmth, the silence of the forest pressing in on them, broken only by the sigh of the wind and their own ragged breaths. Myra held Samuel close, trying to shield him from the worst of the cold, though his unnatural coolness seemed to seep into her own body. "Do you think anyone else made it out?" whispered the other woman, Alara. Myra didn't answer for a moment. She thought of Caleb's last stand, of Tabitha's desperate charge, of Jedediah's horrified realization. "I don't know," she finally said. "I hope so, but—" The unspoken truth hung heavy between them. Haven was lost, consumed by a hunger that had festered within its own paranoia and isolation, a hunger that had ultimately bloomed into something monstrous and predatory. The very sanctuary they had built to protect themselves from the world's ills had become a crucible for a far more terrifying threat. Myra looked at Samuel again. His luminous eyes were open, staring up at the dark overhang. Was there any of the original child left within that changed form? Or was he simply a vessel, a spore servant in miniature? The fungal tendril by his eye seemed to pulse with a faint, independent light. A bitter taste filled Myra's mouth. They had escaped the immediate slaughter, but what future did they have? They were alone, deep in a winter wilderness, with no food, no shelter beyond this miserable rock, and carrying a child who was himself a manifestation of the horror they had fled. The irony was cruel. In their obsessive preparation for a doomsday that never came in the way they expected, the community of Haven had meticulously cultivated the seeds of their own destruction. Their stored food, their hoarded supplies, had become the breeding ground for the blight. Their isolation, meant to protect them, had only ensured that when the horror bloomed, there was no one to help, no escape from its insidious spread. The hunger had won, not by simple starvation, but by offering a terrible, transformative alternative. It had called to their deepest fears and desires, and they had, one by one, succumbed. As Myra shivered in the cold, Samuel an unnerving weight in her arms, she knew their journey was far from over. The blight was not confined to Haven. She carried a part of it with her. The bitter bloom of that cursed valley had cast its seeds into the wind, and she, an unwilling custodian, was now tasked with an impossible choice: to try and find a cure for an incurable corruption, or to accept that some hungers, once awakened, could never truly be sated. The forest around them was dark and silent, but Myra fancied she could still hear, very faintly, the distant, malevolent hum, a reminder that the hunger was patient and its tendrils reached far. The true test of survival had only just begun. Chapter 10: Whispers in the Wilderness. The first days after their escape from Haven were a desperate blur of cold, hunger, and fear. Myra Clay, Sarah, and Alara pushed themselves onward, driven by the primal need to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the horrors they had witnessed. The snow, which had initially been a blessing, covering their tracks, soon became an adversary, making each step an exhausting effort, chilling them to the bone. Myra carried Samuel, the blighted child, strapped to her chest with strips of torn cloth from her shawl. He remained unnervingly silent, his luminous eyes wide and watchful, the fungal tendril near his eye slowly, almost imperceptibly, growing. His unnatural coolness was a constant, chilling presence against her skin. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when the wind howled through the skeletal trees, Myra thought she could feel a faint vibration emanating from him, a miniature echo of the terrible hum that had pulsed from the entity in Haven. It terrified her, but Tabitha's sacrifice, her desperate hope, bound Myra to the child. Sarah and Alara, traumatized and ill-equipped for the harsh wilderness, struggled. Sarah, the younger of the two, wept often, her grief and fear a raw, open wound. Alara, older and more stoic, tried to maintain a semblance of composure, but her eyes held a haunted look, and her hands trembled constantly. They had no food beyond a few bitter roots Myra managed to dig from the frozen earth, and the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs was a constant torment. Myra, drawing on the dregs of her herbal knowledge, searched for anything edible, pine needles for a weak, vitamin C-rich tea lichen scraped from rocks, the tough inner bark of certain trees. It was meager sustenance, barely enough to keep them moving. The memory of Haven's overflowing root cellars, now a source of unimaginable horror, was a cruel irony. On the third night, huddled together in a makeshift shelter of fallen branches, Ilara began to cough, a dry, racking sound that shook her thin frame. By morning, she was feverish. "We need to find proper shelter," Myra said, her voice tight with worry. "And food, real food." But the forest offered little. The game Barnaby Finch had once hunted so skillfully seemed to have vanished, just as he'd claimed. The silence of the woods was profound, broken only by the wind and their own labored movements. It was an unnatural quiet, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Sometimes Myra would catch Sarah staring at Samuel with a mixture of fear and revulsion. That thing," Sarah whispered one afternoon when Ilara was lost in a feverish sleep. "It's not right, Myra. It's part of what destroyed Haven. We should leave it." Myra looked at Samuel, at his pale, still face, the tiny, glowing tendril. "He's a child, Sarah, or he was. Tabitha died trying to give him a chance." "Tabitha was mad," Sarah hissed. "They were all mad, that thing. It's a curse. It'll bring them down on us." Myra didn't argue. She understood Sarah's fear. She felt it herself, a cold dread that settled in her heart every time she looked at Samuel, but she couldn't abandon him. Not yet. As Ilara's condition worsened, Myra grew more desperate. She ranged further from their crude shelters, searching for anything that might help. It was during one of these solitary foraging trips, as dusk was painting the snowy landscape in shades of purple and gray, that she heard it. A whisper. It was faint, carried on the wind, almost indistinguishable from the rustle of dry leaves clinging to skeletal branches. But it was there, a soft, sibilant sound, like someone murmuring just out of earshot. Myra froze, her heart pounding. She scanned the surrounding trees, her hand instinctively going to the small knife she carried at her belt. The forest was still, silent, draped in shadow. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely a breath. Only the wind answered. She told herself it was her imagination, her mind strained by hunger and exhaustion. But the feeling of being watched, of an unseen presence nearby, lingered. The next day, Ilara was weaker, her breathing shallow. Myra knew she didn't have much time. They needed to find help, a settlement, anything. But the wilderness stretched endlessly around them, a vast, indifferent expanse of snow and trees. That afternoon, as Myra was trying to coax a few sips of weak pine needle tea into Ilara, Sarah suddenly gasped, her eyes wide with terror, fixed on something beyond Myra's shoulder. Myra whirled around. Standing at the edge of their small clearing, partially hidden by the trunk of a massive pine, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, cloaked in what looked like layers of tattered animal skins and woven grasses, blending almost perfectly with the winter landscape. Its face was obscured by shadow and a hood, but Myra could see the glint of watchful eyes. Before Myra could speak or react, the figure raised a hand, a single, long-fingered digit pointing towards a barely visible game trail leading deeper into the woods. Then, as silently as it had appeared, it melted back into the trees, vanishing as if it were a figment of the forest itself. Sarah was trembling violently. What was that? Who was that? Myra didn't know, a lone trapper, a hermit, or something else. The figure hadn't seemed overtly threatening, but its silent appearance and disappearance were deeply unsettling. And the way it had pointed, was it a warning or an invitation? Desperation made the decision for them. Alara was fatting. They had nothing to lose. "We have to follow," Myra said, her voice resolute. "Maybe they know of shelter, maybe they have food." Leaving Alara bundled as warmly as possible, Myra and Sarah, with Samuel still strapped to Myra's chest, set off down the faint trail indicated by the strange figure. The path was narrow, winding through dense thickets and over fallen logs. The feeling of being watched intensified, and Myra heard the faint whispers again, closer this time, seeming to emanate from the rustling canopy above. After nearly an hour of difficult travel, the trail opened into a small, secluded hollow. Nestled within it, almost invisible until they were upon it, was a crude dwelling. It was built of rough-hewn logs, mud, and stones, with a roof of bark and sod. A thin tendril of smoke curled from a hole in the roof, promising warmth. As they approached cautiously, the door, a heavy slab of wood, creaked open. The same cloaked figure emerged, beckoning them forward with a slow, deliberate gesture. Myra hesitated. This could be a trap, but Alara's life hung in the balance. Swallowing her fear, she stepped into the hollow. Sarah followed, clutching Myra's arm. The figure led them inside the dwelling. The interior was dark, lit only by a small, smoky fire in a central hearth. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, dried herbs, and something else, something faintly musky and wild. As her eyes adjusted, Myra saw that the walls were hung with bundles of dried plants, animal pelts, and strange, carved wooden totems. The figure finally lowered its hood. It was a woman, her face a roadmap of wrinkles, her eyes dark and piercing, like polished stones. Her hair, streaked with gray, was woven with small bones and feathers. She was old, ancient perhaps, but her gaze was sharp, intelligent, and unnervingly knowing. "You are far from your broken nest," the old woman said, her voice a low, raspy whisper like wind through dry reeds. It was the voice Myra had heard in the forest. Myra stared at her. "Who are you?" The old woman smiled, a slow, enigmatic expression. "Some call me Silva. The forest is my home, and sometimes it sends me lost things." Her gaze flickered to Samuel nestled against Myra's chest. The smile faded. "You carry a heavy burden, child of the fallen haven." Myra's heart clenched. "You know of Haven." "The forest knows," Silva said, her eyes seeming to look through Myra. "It felt the sickness, the bitter bloom, it heard the hunger's call." She turned towards the fire. "Your friend is fatting, bring her. There is little time." Hope, fragile but insistent, flickered within Myra. This woman, this Silva, she was strange, wild, but she spoke with an ancient wisdom, and she didn't seem to fear Samuel or the blight he represented. Perhaps, just perhaps, she was not another enemy, but an ally in this desolate wilderness. Or perhaps, Myra thought with a shiver, she was something else entirely, something tied to the very fabric of this whispering, watchful land. Chapter 11. The Forest's Lore. Myra and Sarah, with considerable effort, managed to carry the near-unconscious Alara to Silva's crude dwelling. The old woman directed them to lay Alara on a low pallet of furs near the hearth. Silva then moved with a surprising agility for her age, her gnarled fingers selecting various dried herbs and roots from the bundles hanging on the walls. She crushed them in a stone mortar, her movements precise and ritualistic, murmuring softly in a language Myra didn't recognize. Perhaps the same guttural tongue Hester Vale had used in her terrible rites, or something older still. The air in the hut grew thick with the pungent aroma of the brewing concoction. Silva added water from a skin pouch and heated the mixture over the fire, her dark eyes never leaving Alara's pale face. Sarah huddled by the doorway, watching the old woman with a mixture of fear and awe. Myra, holding Samuel, stood near the fire, trying to absorb some of its warmth. The child remained still, his luminous eyes fixed on the dancing flames. The tiny fungal tendril by his eye seemed to pulse faintly in the firelight. Silva finally strained the dark, steaming liquid into a wooden bowl. "Hold her head," she instructed Myra. Together, they managed to coax a few sips of the bitter brew past Alara's lips. Alara coughed weakly, but swallowed. Silva then gently applied a poultice of crushed leaves and mud to Alara's chest, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Now we wait," Silva said, settling back on her haunches, her gaze fixed on Alara. "The forest will decide if her spirit is strong enough to return." The silence in the hut was broken only by Alara's shallow breathing and the crackle of the fire. Myra watched Silva, her mind filled with questions. "How did you know about Haven?" Myra finally asked, her voice low. "How did you know we were out here?" Silva's eyes shifted to Myra. "The whispers, child. The forest speaks to those who listen. It felt the disturbance when your Haven changed. The land remembers such imbalances, and she tapped her chest, "I am a listener." "The whispers I heard, that was you." Silva nodded slowly. "Sometimes. Sometimes it is just the wind or the trees sharing their secrets, but I guided you. The forest did not want more of that sickness, to take root without witness." Her gaze flickered to Samuel, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, caution perhaps, or a deep, ancient sorrow. "This sickness," Myra pressed, "the blight, the fungus, what is it, do you know?" Silva was silent for a long moment, her gaze lost in the flames. "It is old," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "Older than the mountains, a seed of hunger sleeping deep in the earth. Your people in their fear and their digging, their desperate desire to hoard against a changing world. They disturbed its slumber. They fed it with their paranoia, their spoiled hopes." Myra felt a chill despite the fire. Jedediah's root cellar dug deeper and deeper each year. Had they unknowingly breached some ancient, dormant prison? "The fungus," Silva continued, "is merely its bloom, its way of spreading, of calling to others. It offers a false communion, a promise of ending hunger by becoming part of a greater, unthinking hunger. "The hunger's call," Myra whispered, remembering the insidious pull she had felt. Silva nodded. "It seeks to consume all individuality, all thought, merging everything into its own mindless, growing mass. The entity you saw on the pyre, that was its heart, newly awakened, hungry to assimilate." "Can it be stopped?" Myra asked, her voice tight with a desperate hope. "Is there a cure for Samuel?" She looked down at the child, at the tiny, glowing tendril. Silva's gaze softened slightly as she looked at Samuel. "The child is deeply touched. The bloom has taken root in fertile soil. To remove it now, it might destroy what little of the boy remains." She sighed, a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone. "There are no easy cures for what sleeps beneath the skin of the world, child. Only balance, containment. Sometimes a fire is needed to cleanse a corrupted patch of forest, to allow new growth." Myra's heart sank. Fire, destruction, was that the only answer? "But you helped Alara," Myra pointed out. "The potion, will it work?" "What I gave her is of the forest," Silva explained. "It will fight the fever, strengthen her spirit, but the blight, if its tendrils have taken hold in her soul, then even the forest's strongest medicine may not be enough. It becomes a battle within her. The forest can only offer strength, not dictate the outcome." Hours passed. Ilara's breathing seemed to deepen slightly, the flush of fever on her cheeks lessening. Myra and Sarah took turns watching over her, while Silva moved about her hut, tending to her strange collection of herbs, pelts, and carvings, sometimes humming a low, monotonous tune that seemed to blend with the sounds of the forest outside. As dawn approached, Ilara stirred. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked around, confused, her gaze falling on Myra. "Myra," she whispered, her voice weak but clear, where are we?" Relief, immense and overwhelming, washed over Myra. "You're safe, Ilara, you're safe." Silva nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "Her spirit is strong. The forest has given her a chance." Over the next few days, under Silva's strange but effective care, Ilara slowly regained some of her strength. The old woman fed them a thin but nourishing broth made from game she trapped with an almost preternatural skill, supplemented with roots and dried berries. She taught Myra and Sarah which lichens were safe to eat, how to find water beneath the snow, how to read the subtle signs of the forest. Silva spoke little of herself, but bits and pieces of her story emerged. She was the last of a long line of listeners, women who lived in symbiosis with the forest, understanding its rhythms, its dangers, and its hidden powers. They were guardians of a sort against the imbalances that sometimes arose, both natural and otherwise. She also spoke more of the blight, which she called the silent hunger, or the earth mold. She described it not as an evil entity in the way Jedediah might have understood, but as a primal force of nature, a form of decomposition and reclamation that had been thrown out of balance, awakened prematurely and aggressively by Haven's actions. "Your Haven," Silva said one evening as they sat around the fire, Samuel asleep in Myra's lap, his faint glow a constant, eerie presence. It sought to wall itself off from the cycles of life and death, of growth and decay. It tried to hoard life to stop time. The earth mold is the cycle reasserting itself, but in a twisted, hungry way because it too was starved, locked away. Myra thought of Haven's meticulously kept records, its rigid schedules, its desperate attempts to control every aspect of their existence. They had feared the chaos of the outside world, but in doing so, they had created a stagnant pool where a different kind of chaos could breed. "What about them?" Sarah asked hesitantly, voicing the fear that still lingered in all of them. "The ones back in Haven, the blighted, will they come looking for us?" Silva's expression became grave. The earth mold seeks to spread, its hunger is not sated. The ones it has claimed are its limbs, its senses. They will feel the absence of the child. Her gaze rested on Samuel. He carries a strong seed of the bloom. They will be drawn to it like moths to a flame. A cold dread filled Myra. They were not safe. They were merely in a temporary reprieve, and Samuel, the child she was trying to save, was a beacon for the very horror they had fled. "What can we do?" Myra asked, her voice barely a whisper. Silva looked out through the open doorway of the hut towards the dark, snow-laden trees. "The forest offers paths, child. Some lead to shelter, some lead to danger, and some lead to places where one might confront the shadows." Her eyes met Myra's, ancient and knowing. "The choice of path is always yours, but the whispers in the wilderness are growing louder, and they are no longer just mine." Myra clutched Samuel closer. The relative peace of Silva's hut suddenly felt fragile, threatened. The forest was not just a refuge, it was a place of ancient powers and looming threats. And the blighted were out there, their hunger unslaked, drawn by the faint, sweet scent of the bloom that pulsed from the child in her arms. The wilderness had offered them a temporary sanctuary, but it was also poised to become their next battleground. Chapter 12. The Scent of the Bloom. Life in Silva's secluded hollow settled into a fragile routine. Ilara, though still weak, was slowly recovering, her cough fading, her eyes regaining some of their former light. Sarah, while still prone to bouts of fear, found a measure of purpose in helping Silva with her daily tasks, gathering firewood, preparing food, learning the rudiments of the old woman's strange forest craft. Myra, however, found little peace. Silva's words about the blighted being drawn to Samuel echoed constantly in her mind. She watched the child with a new, heightened anxiety. The fungal tendril by his eye was undeniably larger, coiling like a pale, fleshy vine against his translucent skin. His unnatural coolness persisted, and sometimes when she held him close, she could feel that faint, rhythmic pulsing, a silent heartbeat of the blight within him. He never cried, never smiled, his luminous eyes simply observing the world with an unnerving, ancient stillness. Silva treated Samuel with a cautious respect, occasionally offering him a few drops of a clear, odorless liquid she distilled from certain types of tree sap. "To soothe the restless seed," she would murmur, "not to remove it. That path is fraught with its own perils." Myra tried to understand. If the blight is a natural force out of balance, can it be rebalanced within him? Silva shook her head slowly. "He is not a forest child where a controlled burn can clear the undergrowth for new life. He is too small, the bloom too deeply rooted, to fight it directly within him now. You might unravel the very threads of his being." Her gaze was somber. Some corruptions, once they take hold, become part of what they corrupt. The question is, what part will dominate? The whispers in the wilderness, as Silva had warned, were indeed growing louder. Not just the rustling of leaves or the sigh of the wind, but something more directed, more sentient. Myra would hear them when she ventured out to gather herbs or check Silva's snares, faint, sibilant voices just at the edge of hearing, seeming to call her name or Samuel. Sometimes she would catch fleeting glimpses of movement in the deep shadows of the forest, figures that vanished when she turned her head. Sarah heard them too. "They're out there," she'd whisper to Myra, her eyes wide with terror. "I know they are. They're looking for us, for him." She would cast a fearful glance at Samuel. Even the animals seemed agitated. The birds were often silent, and Silva's snares, usually reliable, began to come up empty more frequently. "The forest is uneasy," Silva observed one evening, her brow furrowed as she stared into the dying embers of the fire. "The scent of the bloom is on the wind, and it draws more than just its own kind." One afternoon, Myra was checking a line of snares near a frozen stream, some distance from Silva's hollow. Samuel was strapped to her chest, his quiet presence a familiar if unsettling weight. The air was still, the snow-covered landscape hushed. Suddenly, a twig snapped nearby. Myra froze, her hand instinctively going to her knife. She scanned the dense thicket of fir trees. Nothing. Then a low growl. From behind a snow-laden bush, a wolf emerged. It was gaunt, its fur matted, but its eyes glowed with the same milky luminescence as the blighted, as Samuel. And from its muzzle, where saliva should have dripped, hung a pale, stringy filament of fungal matter. Myra's breath caught in her throat. The blight had spread beyond humans. It was infecting the wildlife. The wolf advanced slowly, its glowing eyes fixed on Samuel. It wasn't the predatory hunger of a normal starving animal. It was something else, something colder, more focused. It was drawn to the bloom. Myra backed away slowly, her heart hammering. She had no weapon against a wolf, let alone a blighted one. Suddenly, an arrow hissed through the air, striking the wolf in the flank. The creature yelped, stumbled, then turned with a snarl towards the direction the arrow had come from. Silva stepped out from behind a tree, another arrow already knocked in her bow. Her face was grim. "The forest's creatures should not suffer this corruption," she said, her voice tight. The blighted wolf, seemingly unconcerned by the arrow protruding from its side, launched itself at Silva. Silva loosed her second arrow, hitting the wolf in the chest, but it kept coming, its glowing eyes blazing. Myra, seeing Silva in danger, acted on instinct. She grabbed a heavy, dead branch from the ground and swung it with all her might, connecting with the side of the wolf's head. The creature yelped again, staggered and fell, its limbs twitching. The milky glow in its eyes faded, replaced by the dull glaze of death. From its wounds, not blood, but pale fungal tendrils began to sprout, writhing for a moment before becoming still. Myra stared at the dead wolf, her chest heaving. Silva approached cautiously, nudging the creature with her bow. "It is as I feared," Silva said, her voice grave. "The earth mold is spreading its tendrils wide. It seeks new vessels, new forms to carry its seed." She looked at Myra, then at Samuel. The scent of the bloom on him. It is a beacon stronger than I thought. This will not be the last creature or person drawn to it. They dragged the wolf's carcass back to the hollow. Silva insisted on burning it completely, despite their dwindling firewood. No part of the blight should be left to fester to reseed, she explained, her face grim as she watched the flames consume the creature. The smoke that rose from the pyre was acrid, carrying the faint, sweetish odor of the blight. That night no one slept well. The encounter with the blighted wolf had shattered their fragile sense of security. The enemy was not just the remnants of Haven. It was the land itself, potentially becoming corrupted, turning against them. A few days later, as a thaw set in, turning the snow to slush and mud, Sarah was gathering water from the stream when she came running back to the hut, her face pale with terror. "Footprints," she gasped. "Down by the stream in the mud, not animal prints, human, several sets, and they were fresh." Silva and Myra exchanged a look. "They have found us," Silva said quietly, her voice devoid of surprise. "Or rather, they have found the scent of the bloom." Myra's heart sank, the blighted from Haven. They had tracked them relentlessly through the wilderness. "What do we do?" Sarah cried, wringing her hands. "We can't fight them, not all of them." Silva looked at Myra, her ancient eyes holding a new intensity. "There is a place," she said slowly, "a sanctuary hidden deep in the oldest part of the forest, a place the earth mold has difficulty reaching. My ancestors knew of it. It is a hard journey and dangerous, but it may be your only hope of evading them for a time, of giving the child a chance." "A sanctuary," Myra echoed. "Why haven't you taken us there before?" "The path is not for the weak of spirit," Silva said, "and it requires a certain understanding of the forest's ways. I did not know if you were ready, but now there is no choice." She looked at Samuel, a flicker of something almost like pity in her eyes. "The bloom he carries is too strong a lure. Here, you are merely postponing the inevitable." Myra looked at Sarah and Alara, at their frightened faces. Then she looked at Samuel, at the silent, unknowable child who was both her burden and her flickering hope. Escape was no longer enough. They needed more than just to run. They needed a place where the hunger's call could not reach, or where its power was diminished. "Tell us about this place," Myra said, her voice firm despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Tell us how to get there." Silva nodded. "It is called the Heartwood, but be warned, child. The forest guards its secrets well, and not all that dwells in the deep woods is as straightforward as the blighted." The scent of the bloom had led their enemies to their doorstep. Now, it was forcing them deeper into a wilderness that held its own ancient secrets and unknown perils. The journey to the Heartwood would be their most desperate gamble yet. Chapter 13. The Perilous Path to Heartwood. The decision to seek the Heartwood, Silva's hidden sanctuary, cast a new, urgent tension over the small group. The knowledge that the blighted were close, drawn by the potent scent of the bloom emanating from Samuel, meant there was no time to waste. Silva made swift preparations, packing meager supplies of dried meat, roots, and her essential herbs into skin pouches. Her movements were economical, her ancient face set in grim lines. "The journey will take several days, perhaps more, if the forest is uncooperative," Silva explained, her voice low as she secured a flint and steel to her belt. "We travel light, and we travel fast. The blighted are relentless when the bloom calls them." Ilara, though still frail, insisted she could make the journey. "I will not be left behind to be consumed," she said, her voice thin but determined. Sarah, despite her palpable fear, nodded in agreement, her gaze darting nervously towards the dark tree line that surrounded the hollow. Myra Clay secured Samuel more tightly to her chest. The child remained his usual unnerving self, silent, cool to the touch, his luminous eyes wide and observant. The fungal tendril by his eye seemed to have grown slightly thicker overnight, a constant, terrifying reminder of the blight he carried, the blight that was now their hunter. They set out at dawn, under a sky the color of bruised plums. Silva led the way, moving through the thawing, muddy forest with a sureness that belied her age. She chose paths that were barely visible, winding through dense undergrowth, across slick, moss-covered rocks and over swollen streams that gurgled with meltwater. There was no trail to follow, only Silva's innate understanding of the wilderness. The forest around them felt different now, more oppressive. The brief sanctuary of Silva's Hollow was behind them, and the deeper woods loomed, ancient and watchful. The whispers Myra had heard before seemed more persistent here, more tangible, as if the trees themselves were murmuring secrets or warnings she couldn't quite decipher. Sometimes, she would catch fleeting glimpses of movement in her peripheral vision, shadows that darted between trees, shapes that didn't quite belong to the natural landscape. "The forest is old here," Silva said, sensing Myra's unease. "Older than memory. It has its own spirits, its own guardians. Most are indifferent to the passage of small lives like ours, but some are drawn to strong scents, like fear or the bloom." Her gaze flickered meaningfully towards Samuel. On the second day, they found signs that confirmed their fears. Silva, her eyes scanning the muddy ground, pointed to a series of large, misshapen footprints. "Blighted," she confirmed, her voice grim. "At least 2 of them. They passed this way not long ago. They are tracking us." A fresh wave of fear washed over Sarah and Ilara. Myra felt her own stomach tighten. The blighted were not just a distant threat. They were actively hunting them, their unnatural senses homed in on Samuel. Silva pushed them harder after that, taking even more obscure routes, sometimes doubling back on their tracks or leading them through icy streams to try and mask their scent. The journey was grueling. Their muscles ached, their feet were raw, and the gnawing hunger was a constant companion, despite the meager rations Silva provided. Samuel, however, seemed unaffected by the hardship. He remained silent, his luminous eyes absorbing everything. Myra worried that the exertion, the cold, would somehow worsen his condition, but the blight within him seemed to sustain him in some unnatural way. Sometimes, she would feel that faint, rhythmic pulsing against her chest, stronger now, and she wondered if the bloom was flourishing in the harsh environment, drawing on some unseen energy. One evening, as they huddled around a small, smokeless fire Silva had managed to build in a sheltered ravine, they heard it. A distant, chilling sound that echoed through the dark trees. A chorus of guttural moans and ecstatic cries, punctuated by a familiar, insane laughter. "Hester Vale," Myra breathed, her blood running cold. Silva nodded, her face grim in the firelight. They are closer than I thought. The bloom calls to them strongly. What do we do? Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. They'll find us by morning. Silva stared into the darkness beyond their fire. Tomorrow we enter the old growth. The trees there are ancient, their roots deep. The power of the earth mold is different there, muted perhaps by older forces. It is our best chance. The old growth, when they reached it late the next day, was like stepping into another world. The trees were colossal, their trunks wider than Silva's hut, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out much of the sky, plunging the forest floor into a perpetual twilight. The air was still, heavy, and carried the scent of damp earth, ancient wood, and something else. A faint, almost metallic tang. The whispers here were deeper, more resonant, like the breathing of a slumbering giant. The ground was a tangled mat of gnarled roots, thick moss and strange, pale fungi that glowed faintly in the gloom. Different from the blight's bloom, these seemed more natural, yet equally alien. Silva moved with even greater caution here, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Tread carefully, she warned. The guardians of the heartwood are jealous of their domain. Show respect. Make no loud noises. Take nothing that is not freely offered. As they ventured deeper into the old growth, Myra began to feel a strange pressure in her head, a dizziness that was different from the hum of the blighted. It was as if the ancient energies of this place were pressing in on her, scrutinizing her. Samuel, too, seemed to react. The faint pulsing against Myra's chest became more erratic, and he let out a small, soft whimper, the first sound Myra had heard him make beyond a sigh. The fungal tendril by his eye twitched. Suddenly, Silva stopped, holding up a hand. Wait. Ahead of them, the already dim light seemed to dim further. A section of the forest was shrouded in an unnatural darkness, a pool of shadow that seemed to absorb all light. From within it came a faint, rustling sound, like dry leaves skittering across stone, but there was no wind. What is it? Alara whispered, her voice tight with fear. A shade weaver, Silva murmured, her eyes narrowed. A spirit of the deep woods. It guards this path. We must not disturb it. She led them on a wide detour around the patch of unnatural darkness, moving slowly, silently. Myra could feel unseen eyes watching them, a cold, ancient intelligence that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Later, as they crossed a clearing filled with unnervingly symmetrical standing stones, half buried in moss, Sarah let out a small cry. She pointed to one of the stones. Scratched into its surface, fresh and raw, were crude symbols. Myra recognized some of them. They were the same symbols Hester Vale and her followers had painted on the walls of their cabins in Haven before the final terrible outbreak. They've been here, Myra said, her voice barely a whisper. The blighted, they know of this place too. Silva's face was grim. The earth mold is old. It has memories. Perhaps some of its corrupted servants are drawn by more than just the bloom. Perhaps they seek something else in the heartwood. The thought was terrifying. If the heartwood was not a sanctuary from the blight, but another target, then their journey was even more desperate than they had imagined. As night fell, deeper and more absolute in the old growth than anywhere else Myra had ever experienced, Silva led them to the base of a truly colossal tree, its trunk a gnarled fortress of ancient wood. A narrow opening, like a dark mouth, was visible between two massive roots. "Here," Silva said, "we rest here. The roots of the great tree offer some measure of protection." The space within the roots was cramped but surprisingly dry. They ate their meager rations in silence, the oppressive presence of the old growth weighing heavily on them. Myra held Samuel close, trying to shield him from the chilling dampness. The child was restless, his small body occasionally twitching, the fungal tendril by his eye glowing more brightly than ever. Suddenly, Samuel let out a sharp, piercing cry, a sound so unlike his usual silence that it made them all jump. It wasn't a cry of pain or hunger, but something else, a call. And from the darkness outside, an answer came. A chorus of guttural moans and Hester Vale's triumphant, insane laughter, much closer than before. "They're here," Sarah shrieked, scrambling to the back of the root hollow. Silva peered out through the narrow opening. Her face was a mask of grim understanding. "The child's bloom. It has flared in this ancient place. It has called them directly to us." The perilous path had led them not to safety, but seemingly into the jaws of the trap. The heartwood was not yet reached, and their enemies were upon them, drawn by the very thing Myra was trying to save. Chapter 14. The Guardians and the Grove. The triumphant cries of the blighted echoed through the ancient, twilit forest, drawing nearer to the massive tree where Myra and the others had taken refuge. Hester Vale's crazed laughter was a particularly chilling punctuation to the guttural chorus. They were exposed, trapped, with Samuel's intensified bloom acting as an undeniable beacon. "They will be upon us in moments," Silva stated, her voice grim but steady. She gripped the worn wooden staff she always carried, its tip carved into the likeness of a hawk's head. "There is no running now, not in this old growth. We make our stand or we are consumed." Ilara, despite her fear, found a heavy, gnarled branch. Sarah, trembling, clutched a sharpened stone Myra had given her. Myra herself, with Samuel strapped to her chest, held her small knife, knowing it was a pitiful defense against the monstrously transformed blighted. The first figures emerged from the gloom, their forms distorted, their eyes glowing with the milky luminescence of the blight. Solomon Birch was among them, his movements unnervingly fluid, his skin now almost entirely a patchwork of pale, pulsating fungus. He carried a heavy, sharpened piece of wood like a club. Behind him, more blighted fanned out, their numbers greater than Myra had anticipated. Perhaps a dozen or more. Had they found new recruits in the wilderness? Or had Haven's fall been even more complete than she'd realized? Hester Vale pushed her way to the front, her fungal appendage writhing like a nest of pale snakes. Her eyes, blazing with fanatical light, fixed on Samuel. "The child of the bloom," she shrieked, her voice cracking. "The first mother calls him. He will complete the circle. He will make us whole. He is not yours to take, abomination." Silva's voice rang out, surprisingly powerful. She stepped forward from the root hollow, positioning herself between the blighted and the entrance. Hester cackled. "The old forest witch. You cannot stop the hunger, crone. It is the true way of the world. All things decay. All things returned to the mold. She gestured, and the blighted began to advance, their moans rising in pitch. Myra braced herself, shielding Samuel with her body. This was it, the end of their desperate flight. But as the first blighted reached the edge of the massive tree's root system, something extraordinary happened. The very air around the tree seemed to shimmer. The deep, resonant whispers of the old growth, which had been a constant background hum, suddenly intensified, coalescing into a tangible force. From the gnarled roots of the great tree, and from the surrounding ancient behemoths, shadowy forms began to detach themselves. They were vaguely humanoid, but taller, thinner, their limbs elongated, their features indistinct, as if woven from shadow and moonlight. Their eyes were points of cold, green light. Guardians of the heartwood, Myra realized with a jolt of awe and terror. The spirits Silva had warned them about. These shadowy sentinels moved with an unnerving, silent grace, flowing between the blighted like smoke. They carried no weapons, yet where they passed, the blighted recoiled, some even crying out in what sounded like pain, their fungal growths shriveling and blackening as if touched by an unseen fire. Hester Vale shrieked in fury, her fungal appendage lashing out at one of the shadow guardians. The appendage passed right through the spectral form, which then turned its cold, green gaze upon her. Hester stumbled back, clutching her head, a look of agony on her face. "No, the mother's power is greater," she screamed, but her voice held a new note of fear. The blighted, disoriented, and clearly harmed by the spectral guardians, hesitated in their advance. Silva seized the moment. "Now," she cried to Myra, "through the roots, there is a passage. It leads deeper towards the heartwood's core." Myra didn't need telling twice. She scrambled towards a narrow fissure Silva indicated at the very back of the root hollow, a space barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Ilara and Sarah followed, their faces pale but filled with a desperate, renewed hope. The passage was dark, tight, and smelled of ancient earth and decay, but a natural decay, not the sweet, sickly aroma of the blight. Myra could hear the sounds of the battle raging outside the great tree, the unearthly cries of the shadow guardians, the pained shrieks of the blighted, and Silva's occasional sharp command or the thud of her staff. The passage twisted and turned, sloping downwards. Samuel, strangely, had fallen silent again after his initial cry, his luminous eyes closed, the pulsing of the bloom against Myra's chest becoming calmer, almost soothed by the deep, earthy energies of this place. After what felt like an eternity of claustrophobic crawling, the passage began to widen, and a faint, silvery light appeared ahead. They emerged, blinking, into a vast, subterranean cavern. It was a place of breathtaking, otherworldly beauty. The cavern was immense, its ceiling lost in shadow far above. The source of the silvery light was a grove of trees unlike any Myra had ever seen. Their trunks were slender, pearlescent white, and their leaves shimmered with an internal luminescence, casting a soft, ethereal glow throughout the cavern. The air was cool, fresh, and carried the scent of unknown blossoms and damp earth. A gentle, melodious sound like distant wind chimes filled the space. This, Myra knew instinctively, was the heartwood, or at least its hidden core. Silva was already there, waiting for them. She was leaning heavily on her staff, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but her eyes shone with a tired triumph. "We are here," she said, "the grove of whispering light. The earth mold's influence is lessened in this place. The ancient spirits hold dominion." "The guardians?" Myra asked, looking back towards the passage. "They will hold the blighted for a time," Silva said, "but they are not a permanent barrier. And Hester, she is strong in her corruption. She will seek other ways." She looked around the glowing grove. "This place offers respite, a chance to breathe, but it is not a fortress." Sarah and Alara stared around in awe, their fear momentarily forgotten in the face of such strange beauty. Even Myra felt a sense of peace she hadn't experienced since long before Haven's fall. The oppressive weight of the old growth was lifted here, replaced by a gentle, calming energy. Samuel, too, seemed different. The fungal tendril by his eye, though still present, seemed less vibrant, its glow softer. The rhythmic pulsing against Myra's chest was almost imperceptible. "What is this place?" Myra asked, her voice hushed. "It is one of the hearts of the forest," Silva explained. "A place where the veil between worlds is thin. The trees here drink moonlight and starlight. Their roots tap into waters that remember the dawn of the world. It is a place of healing, of balance, if one is worthy." Over the next few days, they rested in the grove of whispering light. The glowing trees provided a constant, gentle illumination. A clear, cool spring bubbled from a rock formation, its water sweet and refreshing. Silva found edible fungi, different from the blight. These were pearly white and tasted of nuts, growing at the base of the luminous trees. Alara's strength returned more quickly in this strange, healing atmosphere. Sarah's fear began to recede, replaced by a quiet wonder. Myra, too, felt some of the crushing weight of her journey lift. She spent hours simply sitting amongst the glowing trees, holding Samuel, listening to the gentle, chiming music that seemed to emanate from their leaves. Samuel seemed to be stabilizing. The fungal tendril did not recede, but it did not grow either. His skin, though still pale, lost some of its translucent quality, and a faint, almost human warmth returned to his small body. One afternoon, as Myra hummed a half-forgotten lullaby, she thought she saw the faintest ghost of a smile touch his lips. It was fleeting, perhaps her imagination, but it filled her with a surge of fragile hope. Silva, however, remained watchful. She would often stand at the entrance to the passage leading back to the old growth, listening, her ancient face etched with concern. "They are still out there," she said one evening, her voice grave. "Hester and her strongest followers. The shadow guardians drove them back but did not destroy them. They are regrouping, and the earth mold, its hunger is patient. It will find a way to touch even this place if we give it time." Myra's brief sense of peace shattered. The Heartwood was a sanctuary, but it was not a permanent solution. They had bought time, but the threat of the blight, of Hester Vale's fanatical pursuit, still loomed. "What do we do then?" Myra asked. "We can't stay here forever, can we?" Silva looked at Samuel, then at Myra. "The child, he is at a precipice. The bloom within him is quieted here, but not vanquished. If he leaves this grove now in this state, the earth mold's call will overwhelm him again, perhaps irrevocably. He needs more time, more healing." But if Hester finds a way in? Silva nodded slowly. Then we must ensure that if she does, she finds nothing here to aid her, or that she finds something she did not expect. A new, steely glint appeared in the old woman's eyes. The Heartwood has its own defenses, child, beyond the Shadow Guardians. It has power, and perhaps it is time that power was awakened. The grove of whispering light, a place of healing and peace, was about to become something else. A last bastion, perhaps, or a final, desperate battleground in the war against the insatiable hunger. Myra knew with a chilling certainty that their respite was over. The true test of the Heartwood and of their own courage was about to begin. Chapter 15. The Awakening of the Heartwood. The uneasy peace of the grove of whispering light was irrevocably broken by Silva's grim pronouncement. The knowledge that Hester Vale and her blighted followers were still out there, regrouping, seeking a way into their sanctuary, cast a long shadow over the ethereal beauty of the glowing trees. Myra Clay felt the familiar coils of fear tighten around her heart, but this time it was mingled with a new, desperate resolve. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to simply surrender Samuel or themselves to the earth mold. Silva began her preparations immediately. She led Myra, Sarah, and Alara deeper into the grove, to its very center, where the largest and most luminous of the white-barked trees stood. Its branches reached high into the cavern's shadowed ceiling, its leaves shimmering with an intense, silvery light that pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a gentle heart. "This is the mother tree," Silva said, her voice hushed with reverence. "The source of the grove's light, its life. Its roots run deeper than any other, touching the oldest waters, the purest earth. If there is a power here that can repel the earth mold, it sleeps within her." "How do we awaken it?" Myra asked, gazing up at the magnificent tree. Samuel, cradled in her arms, seemed to stir, his luminous eyes opening to fix on the mother tree, a faint sigh escaping his lips. "It is not a matter of force, child," Silva explained. "The Heartwood responds to balance, to intent. It requires an offering, a joining of spirit." She looked at each of them in turn, her ancient eyes searching. "We must show the mother tree that there is life here worth protecting, a will that stands against the mindless consumption of the blight." Over the next few days, under Silva's guidance, they engaged in a series of quiet rituals. They gathered fallen leaves from the luminous trees, weaving them into garlands. They collected pure water from the spring, offering it to the roots of the mother tree. They sat in silent meditation beneath its branches, focusing their thoughts, their hopes, their fears on the tree's ancient consciousness. Myra included Samuel in these rituals, holding him close, hoping that the grove's healing energies and their focused intent might reach the spark of the child still buried beneath the bloom. During these rituals, Myra felt a profound connection to the grove, a sense of being part of something vast, ancient, and alive. The gentle, chiming music of the leaves seemed to carry whispers of forgotten lore, of the deep, slow rhythms of the earth. Samuel, too, seemed to become calmer, more responsive. The fungal tendril by his eye did not disappear, but its glow softened, and sometimes Myra thought she saw a flicker of genuine human awareness in his luminous gaze. Silva, however, grew more gaunt. her strength seeming to wane as she poured her own life force into the awakening. She spent long hours communing with the mother tree, her gnarled hands pressed against its smooth, white bark, her lips moving in silent incantations. "She is listening," Silva would murmur, her voice weak but her eyes bright with a fervent light. "The heartwood stirs." The signs were subtle at first. The silvery light of the grove seemed to intensify, the melodious chiming of the leaves becoming more resonant. The air grew charged with a palpable energy, a low thrum that vibrated in their bones, similar to the hum of the blighted entity, but different, cleaner, purer, infused with a sense of ancient power rather than mindless hunger. Then one evening, as they sat beneath the mother tree, Silva gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Her eyes widened, fixed on something Myra couldn't see. "They are coming," she whispered, her voice strained. "Hester, she has found a way, a fissure deeper in the old growth, a forgotten path the shadow guardians do not watch closely enough. She is tunneling." Fear, sharp and cold, pierced through Myra's meditative calm. "How long do we have?" "Hours, perhaps less," Silva said, struggling to her feet. "The mother tree is awakening, but slowly. She needs more time. We must buy it for her." There was no thought of escape this time. The grove of whispering light was their last sanctuary, their only hope. If it fell, there would be nowhere left to run. Silva led them to the narrow passage through which they had first entered the grove. "This will be their most likely point of entry," she said. "We must fortify it or create a diversion." But how could 3 women and an ailing crone, armed with little more than sticks and stones, hope to hold off a dozen or more enraged, supernaturally strong blighted? It was Ilara who offered a desperate idea. The blighted, they are drawn to the bloom, to Samuel, but also, they are creatures of rot, of decay. What if we offer them a false scent, something to confuse them, to lead them away from this passage, at least for a while? Myra understood. The blighted wolf they had burned, its carcass had reeked of the blight. If they could create a similar concentration of that scent elsewhere. Silva nodded slowly. A dangerous gambit, to use the blight's own essence against it, but it may give the mother tree the time she needs. Under Silva's direction, they gathered specific types of moss and fungi from the darker, damper edges of the cavern, not the luminous, healing growths of the grove, but their more common, mundane cousins. Silva added crushed herbs that, she claimed, would mimic the particular frequency of the earth mold's scent when burned. They worked quickly, their movements fueled by a desperate urgency. As they prepared their scent bomb, Myra couldn't shake a growing unease. Samuel, who had been relatively calm, began to stir restlessly in her arms. His small body grew warmer, the fungal tendril by his eye pulsing with a brighter, more agitated light. The blight within him was reacting to something. Suddenly, a section of the cavern wall, far from the main passage, began to crumble. Dust and small stones rained down. A low, scraping sound echoed through the grove. "They are here," Silva breathed, her eyes wide. "Hester, she has found another way. She is bypassing the main passage." Panic seized Sarah and Ilara. Myra felt her own heart plummet. Their diversionary tactic was useless if the blighted were already inside. Through the crumbling wall, a pale, fungal hand emerged, its fingers tipped with sharp, blackened nails. Then another. The hole widened and the distorted, glowing face of a blighted warrior peered through, its eyes fixing on them with malevolent hunger. Behind it, more were pressing, their guttural moans echoing in the confined space. Hester Vale's triumphant laughter cut through the air. "Did you think you could hide from the mother's embrace, little witch?" she shrieked from beyond the breach. "The bloom calls to its own. The child will be ours." Chapter 16. The Siege of the Grove. The blighted poured through the newly created breach in the cavern wall, their movements jerky and unnatural, their luminous eyes blazing with fanatical hunger. Hester Vale was at their head, her transformed body a grotesque parody of humanity, the fungal appendage on her side writhing like a sentient creature. She carried a crude, sharpened stone axe, its edge stained with something dark. "The grove will be consecrated," Hester shrieked, her voice echoing off the cavern walls. "The mother tree will become a vessel for the true bloom, and the child will be its heart." Myra, Sarah, and Alara stood frozen for a moment, trapped between the advancing blighted and the serene, glowing mother tree. Silva, however, reacted with surprising speed. "To the mother tree," she cried, her voice cutting through their fear. "Her awakening is near. We must protect her, protect the child." She raised her ancient staff, its hawk-headed tip seeming to glow with a faint, internal light. They scrambled back towards the center of the grove, positioning themselves before the massive, luminous trunk of the mother tree. Samuel, clutched in Myra's arms, was now emitting a low, distressed hum, the fungal tendril by his eye pulsing erratically. The blight within him was agitated, resonating with the proximity of so many of its own kind, and perhaps with the awakening power of the grove itself. The blighted, led by Hester and the formidable Solomon Birch, advanced across the grove, their heavy footsteps crushing the delicate, glowing moss underfoot. The serene beauty of the place was shattered by their grotesque presence, their guttural moans, and the palpable aura of decay that surrounded them. "There is nowhere left to run, Myra Clay," Hester taunted, her glowing eyes fixed on Myra. "Your false hope dies here. Give us the child and your end will be swift." "He is not yours to corrupt," Myra shot back, her voice trembling but firm. She held Samuel tighter, shielding him with her body. Silva stepped forward, planting her staff firmly into the soft earth before the mother tree. "This grove is sacred, defilers," she declared, her voice ringing with an unexpected authority. "You are not welcome here. The spirits of this place reject your foul hunger." As she spoke, the silvery light emanating from the mother tree intensified dramatically. The gentle, chiming music of its leaves swelled into a powerful, resonant chord that vibrated through the very stone of the cavern. The air grew thick with an ancient, untamed energy. The advancing blighted hesitated, some shielding their glowing eyes from the sudden brilliance. Even Hester Vale seemed momentarily taken aback. "Tricks, old woman," she snarled, recovering quickly. "The true power is with the earth mold. Attack. Take the child, claim the grove." The blighted surged forward. Silva struck the ground with her staff. A shockwave of energy rippled outwards, pushing back the first wave of attackers. The ground around the mother tree seemed to hum with power. Luminous vines, thick as pythons, erupted from the earth, snaking towards the blighted, trying to ensnare their limbs. The battle for the heartwood had begun. Myra, Sarah, and Alara fought with the courage of cornered animals. Sarah, surprisingly agile, darted in and out, thrusting with her sharpened stone, aiming for the blighted's glowing eyes. Alara, her strength renewed by the grove's healing air, swung her heavy branch with surprising force. Myra, hampered by Samuel, used her small knife to slash at any blighted that came too close, her movements desperate, defensive. But the blighted were numerous, their unnatural strength and resilience formidable. Their wounds, when inflicted, often sealed quickly with fresh fungal growth. Solomon Birch, a silent, terrifying engine of destruction, battered his way through their meager defenses, his heavy club whistling through the air. Silva was a whirlwind, her ancient staff a blur as she parried blows, channeled bursts of energy from the mother tree, and called upon the grove's subtle defenses. The luminous moss beneath the blighted's feet would sometimes erupt in a flash of burning light, causing them to stumble and shriek. The air itself seemed to resist them, making their movements sluggish. Yet slowly, inexorably, the blighted pressed them back, closer and closer to the trunk of the mother tree. Hester Vale, cackling madly, focused her attacks on Silva, her fungal appendage lashing out like a venomous whip. Myra saw Silva falter, a cry of pain escaping her lips as one of Hester's fungal tendrils scored a deep gash across her arm. Dark, unhealthy-looking blood welled from the wound. The blight could affect even the ancient forest witch. "The old ways are dying, crone," Hester shrieked triumphantly. "The new flesh will inherit the world." Just as Solomon Birch broke through their line, his glowing eyes fixing on Myra and Samuel, a new sound filled the cavern. It was a deep, resonant hum, emanating from the mother tree itself, a sound that dwarfed the hum of the blighted entity, a sound that spoke of ages and ancient terrestrial power. The silvery light from the mother tree pulsed violently, bathing the entire grove in an almost blinding radiance. The luminous vines around its base grew thicker, stronger, lashing out with renewed vigor, dragging blighted warriors to the ground. The very air crackled with energy. The mother tree was fully awake. Samuel, in Myra's arms, let out a high-pitched cry, not of distress this time, but of resonance. The fungal tendril by his eye flared with an intense white light, and for a moment the milky luminescence in his own eyes seemed to clear, replaced by a flash of pure, brilliant blue, the color of a summer sky, a color Myra hadn't seen since before Haven's fall. A shockwave of pure, cleansing energy erupted from Samuel and from the mother tree simultaneously. It washed over the grove, a tangible force. The blighted screamed, a chorus of agony and terror. Their fungal growths writhed, blackened, and began to crumble, turning to ash. Their luminous eyes flickered and died. Solomon Birch, caught in the full force of the wave, let out a terrible, gurgling cry as his transformed body seemed to unravel, the pale fungus slewing off him in smoking chunks, revealing the raw, dying human flesh beneath. He collapsed, dissolving into a pile of reeking decay. Hester Vale, shielded partially by her own powerful connection to the earth mold, was thrown back, her fungal appendage shriveling, smoking. She landed in a heap, her body racked with convulsions, but her eyes, still burning with fanatical hatred, fixed on Samuel. The bloom, betrayed, she choked out, as the last of her blighted followers were consumed by the mother tree's cleansing light. The radiant energy subsided, leaving the grove filled with a soft, silvery glow and the lingering scent of ozone and burned fungus. The remaining blighted were gone, reduced to piles of ash and decaying matter. Myra, Sarah, and Alara stared in stunned disbelief. They were alive. The grove had saved them. Silva, leaning heavily on her staff, her face pale but her eyes shining, looked at the mother tree with profound reverence. "She has purged the infection," she whispered, "for now." But their relief was short-lived. From the pile of smoking decay that had been Hester Vale, a single, thick, black tendril like a searching root uncoiled. It moved with an unnatural speed, slithering across the grove floor, heading directly towards Samuel. Hester, even in her apparent destruction, was making one last, desperate attempt to claim the child, to merge her essence with the powerful bloom he carried. Chapter 17. The Choice of the Bloom. The black, seeking tendril, the last vestige of Hester Vale's malevolent will, slithered across the grove floor with terrifying speed, homing in on Samuel. Myra cried out, instinctively shielding the child, but the tendril was too fast, too determined. It reached Samuel, coiling around his small arm like a dark serpent. Samuel didn't cry out. Instead, his body went rigid. The fungal growth by his eye, which had momentarily receded during the mother tree's cleansing pulse, now flared with an intense, almost black light. The faint human warmth Myra had begun to feel in him vanished, replaced by an icy coldness. His eyes, which had briefly flashed with that startling blue, now glowed with a deep, lightless luminescence, reflecting the dark energy of Hester's tendril. "No!" Myra screamed, trying to pull the tendril away, but it was fused to Samuel's skin, drawing sustenance, pouring its corrupted essence into him. Silva, weakened but resolute, stumbled forward, raising her staff. The earth mold. It tries to claim him fully, to make him its new heart. The mother tree pulsed with a gentle, sorrowful light, its power seemingly unable to differentiate between the child and the invading blight now so intimately merged. Its cleansing wave had destroyed the mature blighted, but this direct, insidious corruption of Samuel, who carried the bloom within his very being, was a different kind of threat. Hester Vale's disembodied, cackling laughter seemed to echo through the grove, though her physical form was gone. "He is ours. The bloom will be perfected. The hunger will reign." Samuel began to convulse in Myra's arms. The black tendril seemed to be absorbed into him, his skin taking on a bruised, unhealthy pallor. The fungal growth by his eye spread rapidly, forming a dark, thorny crown around his small head. His eyes were no longer luminous but voids, reflecting nothing. He was being consumed from within, transformed into something utterly alien, a vessel for the concentrated malice of Hester Vale and the insatiable hunger of the earth mold. Myra watched in horror, tears streaming down her face. This was it, the final corruption. She had failed. Tabitha's sacrifice, their desperate journey, the awakening of the heartwood, all for nothing. "There must be something we can do," Ilara cried, her voice hoarse with despair. Sarah sobbed openly, hiding her face. Silva looked at Samuel, her ancient face etched with a profound sorrow. "The choice is no longer ours," she whispered. "It is his, or what remains of him. The heartwood has offered its balance. The earth mold offers its hunger, the bloom within him. It must choose its nature." As if responding to Silva's words, Samuel's convulsions stopped. He lay still in Myra's arms, his small body radiating an intense, unnatural cold. The dark, thorny crown of fungus pulsed with a malevolent light. For a moment, Myra thought he was gone, that the child she had carried, the faint spark of humanity she had clung to, was extinguished. Then slowly his eyes opened. They were still voids, but deep within them a tiny pinprick of light appeared. A faint, silvery blue, the color of the mother tree's leaves, the color of the summer sky Myra remembered. A struggle was taking place within him, a battle for his very soul. The ancient, healing power of the heartwood, which had seeped into him during their time in the grove, was now fighting against the consuming darkness of Hester's final assault. The grove itself seemed to hold its breath. The light of the mother tree softened, its chiming music becoming a low, mournful thrum. Samuel's small hands clenched. A tiny, almost inaudible sound escaped his lips, not a cry, not a moan, but a word, or something like it, a sound that resonated with both the deep hum of the earth mold and the silvery chime of the heartwood. Enough. The dark, thorny crown of fungus around his head began to wither, to crumble, as if being consumed by an internal fire. The blackness in his eyes receded, slowly pushed back by the expanding pinprick of blue light. The unnatural coldness emanating from him lessened, replaced by a faint, hesitant warmth. The disembodied cackling of Hester Vale faltered, replaced by a shriek of rage and disbelief. No, the hunger is absolute. It cannot be denied. But it was being denied. The bloom within Samuel, nurtured by the desperate love of his mother, protected by Myra's unwavering care, and now infused with the ancient balancing power of the heartwood, was making its choice. It was choosing not mindless consumption, not parasitic existence, but something else, something new. The last vestiges of Hester's dark tendril withered and fell away from Samuel's arm, turning to ash. The thorny crown crumbled completely, leaving only his soft baby hair. The fungal growth by his eye, which had been the most persistent mark of the blight, slowly receded, shrinking, its dark luminescence fading, until only a faint, silvery scar remained, like a tiny, tattooed teardrop. Samuel took a breath, a deep, shuddering inhalation, and then let out a cry. A true cry. The cry of a normal human infant filled with confusion, perhaps a little fear, but undeniably, miraculously alive and himself. His eyes, now fully open, were a clear, vibrant blue, reflecting the silvery light of the grove. He looked up at Myra, and for the first time she saw recognition in his gaze. He reached out a tiny hand, his fingers brushing her cheek. Myra sobbed, tears of grief and overwhelming relief pouring down her face. She clutched him close, burying her face in his soft hair. He was warm. He was real. Silva let out a long, shuddering breath, leaning heavily on her staff. A slow smile spread across her wrinkled face. "The bloom has chosen life," she whispered. "Not the unlife of the earth mold, but true, singular life. The heartwood and the child's own spirit. They have forged something new." The grove seemed to sigh in relief, its silvery light brightening, its chiming music swelling into a gentle, triumphant melody. Sarah and Alara, their faces wet with tears, crowded around Myra, reaching out to touch Samuel, to reassure themselves that the miracle was real. Samuel was no longer a blighted child, a vessel for the earth mold. He was something else. Changed, yes. The faint, silvery scar by his eye was a permanent reminder of what he had endured, what he had overcome. Perhaps he would always carry a unique connection to the natural world, to the cycles of growth and decay, but it would be a connection tempered by humanity, by choice. The immediate threat of Hester Vale and her blighted was gone, consumed by their own hunger and the awakened power of the heartwood. But Myra knew the earth mold itself, the ancient, slumbering hunger deep within the earth, was not truly vanquished. It was merely repelled, dormant again, perhaps, for now. As Myra looked down at Samuel, at his clear blue eyes, at the faint, silvery scar that marked him as a survivor, a child of two worlds, she felt a profound sense of peace, mixed with a new, daunting responsibility. The journey had been one of unimaginable horror, but it had led them here, to this moment of fragile, hard-won hope. The hunger had been faced, and for one small child in one hidden grove it had been overcome. What that meant for the future, for the wider world beyond the forest, Myra didn't know. But as Samuel gurgled, a soft, happy sound, and snuggled closer against her, Myra allowed herself, for the first time in a long, long while, to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, there might be a future worth fighting for after all. The bitter bloom of Haven had, against all odds, produced one small, resilient, and profoundly human flower. Chapter 18. The Scars of the Forest. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation in the Heartwood was one of profound exhaustion and fragile relief. The menacing presence of Hester Vale and her blighted was gone, their dark energy purged by the combined power of the mother tree and the unexpected choice made by the bloom within Samuel. The grove of whispering light returned to its ethereal serenity, its silvery luminescence casting a peaceful glow over the survivors. Samuel miraculously seemed like a normal, healthy baby. He gurgled, he cooed. He even managed a weak but genuine smile when Myra tickled his chin. The luminous, vacant stare was gone, replaced by bright, inquisitive blue eyes. Only the faint, silvery scar beside his eye, like a tiny, tattooed leaf, remained as a testament to the ordeal he had endured, the monstrous hunger he had somehow rejected. Myra found herself constantly checking on him, marveling at his warmth, his soft breaths, the simple miracle of his reclaimed humanity. Silva, though deeply weakened by the effort of awakening the mother tree and defending the grove, began to slowly recover her strength. She spent much of her time in quiet communion with the great, luminous tree, her ancient face serene. The heartwood is at peace again. she told Myra one day, her voice still raspy but imbued with a calm certainty. The earth mold has recoiled. It slumbers for now. Its connection to this place has been severed by the child's choice as much as by the mother tree's power. Sarah and Alara, too, began to heal, both physically and emotionally. The constant fear that had shadowed them for so long began to recede, replaced by a quiet gratitude for their survival. They helped Silva gather food from the grove, the nutty, pearlescent fungi, sweet berries that grew in sheltered crannies, and the clear, life-giving water from the spring. The horrors of Haven, the terror of the blighted hunt, were still raw memories, but the sanctuary of the heartwood provided a space for those wounds to begin to scar over. Yet despite the peace, Myra knew they could not stay in the grove forever. It was a place of magic, of ancient power, but it was not a place for ordinary human lives to take root indefinitely. And the world outside the forest, the world that Haven had so desperately tried to deny, still existed. "What now, Silva?" Myra asked one evening as they sat by the gentle light of the mother tree. Samuel was asleep in her lap, his breathing soft and even. "The earth mold slumbers, you say, but for how long? And what of the world beyond this forest? Is it safe?" Silva looked out towards the shadowed entrance of the grove, her gaze distant. "The earth mold is part of the world, child, just as shadow is part of light. It can never be truly vanquished, only kept in balance. What your Haven awakened was a particularly virulent strain, fed by fear and unnatural hoarding. It may have spread beyond your valley, or it may have receded, its immediate hunger sated by Haven's consumption." Her words were a cold reminder that while their personal nightmare might be over, the potential for such horrors remained. Haven had been an isolated community, but what if similar pockets of fear and paranoia existed elsewhere? What if other desperate people in other hidden places were even now disturbing things best left undisturbed? "And Samuel?" Myra asked, her voice low, looking down at the sleeping child. "He chose life, but he is still different, that scar." "He will always carry the mark of the bloom," Silva affirmed. "And with it a connection to the deeper currents of the world, both the light of the heartwood and the shadow of the earth mold. He will be more sensitive to its stirrings than others. He may even possess certain affinities." She paused, her ancient eyes meeting Myra's. "That is his gift and his burden. It will be up to him and to those who guide him to determine how he uses it." A few weeks later, when the first true signs of spring began to touch the world outside, the snow receding, the faintest green blush appearing on the hardy trees of the old growth, Silva announced that it was time for them to leave the heartwood. "The grove has given you its shelter, its healing," she said, "but its purpose is not to be a permanent refuge for humankind. You must return to your own kind, carry what you have learned back into the sunlit world." The thought of leaving the sanctuary, of facing the uncertainties of the world beyond, was daunting. But Myra knew Silva was right. They could not hide forever. Silva provided them with provisions for their journey: dried meat, ground nuts, and a pouch of the heartwood's healing fungi. She also gave Myra a small, smooth, white stone from the grove. "Keep this close to the child," she instructed. "It will resonate with the good energies he embraced here. It may help too." ground him should the whispers of the earth mold ever grow loud again. Their departure from the grove of whispering light was bittersweet. Myra, Sarah, and Alara offered their profound gratitude to Silva and to the mother tree. As they stepped out of the subterranean sanctuary and back into the filtered sunlight of the old growth, the air felt harsher, the silence of the forest more profound, yet less oppressive than before. The shadow guardians were nowhere to be seen, the path clearer now, as if the forest itself acknowledged their passage. Silva led them to the edge of the old growth, where the ancient, colossal trees gave way to younger, more familiar woodland. "From here you must find your own way," she said. "Head towards the rising sun. Eventually you will find the river. Follow it downstream. It will lead you out of the deepest parts of this forest towards lands where others dwell." Myra looked back at the formidable wall of the old growth, then at the frail but resolute old woman who had saved them. "Will we ever see you again, Silva?" Silva smiled, a slow, enigmatic expression. "The forest has many paths, child, and I am always listening." With a final nod, she turned and melted back into the shadows of the ancient trees, becoming one with the wilderness she embodied. Myra, Sarah, and Alara stood for a moment, a sense of profound loss mingling with their trepidation. Then Myra adjusted Samuel on her hip. He was growing, becoming heavier, and took a deep breath. "Let's go," she said. The journey out of the forest was arduous, but not as terrifying as their flight from Haven. The whispers were fainter now, the feeling of being hunted gone. They encountered wildlife, deer, squirrels, birds that seemed natural, unafraid, a stark contrast to the blighted wolf. The scars of the forest were still visible in places. Patches of unnaturally silent woods, trees with strange, pale fungi clinging to their bark. But these seemed isolated, remnants of the earth mold's passage rather than active threats. Myra often touched the smooth white stone Silva had given her, which she now wore on a leather thong around Samuel's neck. The child seemed healthier, more vibrant than she could have ever hoped. He laughed easily, his blue eyes bright with curiosity. Only the silvery, leaf-shaped scar by his eye hinted at the extraordinary battle he had won. After many days of travel, they finally reached the river Silva had spoken of, a broad, swift-flowing current that promised a path back to civilization. As they prepared to follow its course, Myra looked back at the vast, dark expanse of the forest they were leaving behind. It had been a place of unimaginable horror, of monstrous hunger and terrifying transformations. But it had also been a place of unexpected sanctuary, of ancient magic, and of profound healing. They had survived. They carried the scars, both visible and invisible, but they had endured. And in Samuel they carried a fragile, precious hope, a child who had faced the darkest hunger and chosen light. What that meant for their future, for the future of a world that might still harbor sleeping blights, remained to be seen. But as they turned their faces towards the rising sun, Myra felt not despair, but a quiet, resilient determination. The forest had taught them much about survival, about balance, and about the enduring strength of the human spirit, even in the face of the most bitter of blooms. Chapter 19: Echoes and Dawning. The river was their guide, leading them out of the dense, ancient forest and into more open, rolling countryside. The air grew warmer, the signs of spring more abundant. They saw distant plumes of smoke that spoke of other human settlements, a sight that filled them with both trepidation and a longing for community, for normalcy, however changed their definition of it had become. They were wary, their experiences in Haven and the deep woods having etched a deep caution into their souls. Each new encounter, each sign of human habitation was approached with care. They avoided direct contact at first, observing from a distance, listening to the sounds of life, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children, the lowing of cattle, sounds that were achingly familiar, yet heard now with new ears, acutely aware of the fragility that lay beneath such mundane routines. Samuel continued to thrive. He was a happy, alert child, his blue eyes taking in the world with an almost preternatural awareness. The silvery scar by his eye remained, a subtle, intriguing mark. Myra noticed that he seemed particularly attuned to the natural world. Birds would sometimes land near him without fear, and he would often gaze intently at plants and insects, a look of deep concentration on his small face. The white stone from the heartwood, which he wore constantly, seemed to pulse with a faint, comforting warmth whenever he was agitated or unwell. One day they came upon a small, struggling farming village. It was poor, its fields fallow in places, its people weary and worn. But there was no sign of the blight, no undercurrent of the fanatical paranoia that had consumed Haven. After much cautious observation, Myra, with Sarah and Alara, decided to approach. They were met with suspicion, as was to be expected. 3 women and a child, appearing out of the wilderness, their clothes ragged, their faces etched with hardship. But Myra's knowledge of herbs and healing, skills honed in Haven and supplemented by Silva's forest lore, proved invaluable. She helped deliver a difficult birth, treated a lingering fever that had afflicted several children, and her quiet competence gradually earned them a measure of trust. They spoke little of Haven, and nothing of the earth mold or the heartwood. The horrors they had witnessed were too vast, too unbelievable, for those who had not experienced them. They said they were survivors of a remote settlement that had been destroyed by sickness and a harsh winter, a truth that was, in its own way, accurate. Life in the village was hard, a constant struggle for sustenance. But it was a human struggle, filled with familiar anxieties and small, everyday kindnesses. There was no monstrous hunger here, no insidious call, only the simple, shared burden of survival. Myra often found herself thinking of Silva, wondering about the ancient woman and the secrets of the forest. She knew the earth mold still slumbered, and the thought was a constant, low hum of unease beneath the surface of her new life. She watched Samuel closely, vigilant for any sign that the dormant bloom within him might stir in a negative way. But he remained a source of joy, his unique connection to the world manifesting as a deep empathy, a gentle spirit. One evening, as Myra sat with Samuel by a small stream at the edge of the village, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Samuel, now a toddler beginning to string words together, pointed towards the distant, darkening line of the forest. "Whispers," he said, his blue eyes serious. "Trees, sad." Myra's heart clenched. He could hear them, the echoes of the forest, perhaps even Silva's distant thoughts or the land's own subtle voice. His scar seemed to gleam faintly in the twilight. "What do they say, my love?" Myra asked softly. Samuel looked up at her, his expression unreadable for a moment, reminiscent of that ancient stillness he had possessed in the grove. Then he smiled, a bright, innocent child's smile. "Trees want song." Myra pulled him close, a wave of profound emotion washing over her. He was not a harbinger of doom, nor a simple, ordinary child. He was something in between, a bridge, perhaps, between the world of human understanding and the deeper, wilder magic of the earth. His burden, as Silva had said, would also be his gift. She didn't know what the future held. The world was vast and its shadows were many. The scars of Haven of the forest would always be with them. But as she looked at Samuel, at his bright, hopeful face, she felt a sense of purpose. They would live, they would rebuild, they would remember. And they would carry the lessons of the heartwood, of balance, of resilience, of the courageous choice for life, forward into the dawning of their new world. The hunger had left its mark, an indelible echo in their souls and a silvery scar on a child's face. But it had not extinguished the light. And Myra Clay, survivor of the blighted Haven, mother to a child of two worlds, would ensure that light continued to shine, a small, defiant beacon against any darkness that might yet come. The story of Haven was a warning, but the story of Samuel and of their survival was a testament to the enduring possibility of a new, albeit scarred, beginning. The end.